The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. Chapter 1. The Strange Man's Arrival. The stranger came early in February, one wintry day, through a biting wind and a driving snow, the last snowfall of the year, over the down, walking from Bramblehurst railway station, and carrying a little black portmanteau in his thickly gloved hand. He was wrapped up from head to foot, and the brim of his soft felt hat hid every inch of his face but the shiny tip of his nose. The snow had piled itself against his shoulders and chest, and added a white crest to the burden he carried. He staggered into the coach and horses more dead than alive, and flung his portmanteau down a fire. He cried, "In the name of human charity." A room in a fire, he stamped and shook the snow from off himself in the bar, and followed Mrs. Hall into her guest parlor to strike his bargain. And with that much introduction, that and a couple of sovereigns flung upon the table, he took up his quarters in the inn. Mrs. Hall lit the fire and left him there while she went to prepare him a meal with her own hands. A guest to stop at Iping in the winter-time was an unheard-of piece of luck, let alone a guest who was no haggler, and she was resolved to show herself worthy of her good fortune. As soon as the bacon was well under way, and Milly, her lymphatic maid, had been brisked up a bit by a few deftly chosen expressions of contempt, she carried the cloth, plates, and glasses into the parlor, and began to lay them with the utmost éclat. Although the fire was burning up briskly, she was surprised to see that her visitor still wore his hat and coat, standing with his back to her, and staring out of the window at the falling snow in the yard. His gloved hands were clasped behind him, and he seemed to be lost in thought. She noticed that the melting snow that still sprinkled his shoulders dripped upon her carpet can. "I take your hat and coat." "And give them a good dry in the kitchen." He was not sure she had heard him, and was about to repeat her question. He turned his head and looked at her over his shoulder. "Prefer to keep them on," he said with emphasis. And she noticed that he wore big blue spectacles with sidelights, and had a bush side whisker over his coat collar that completely hid his cheeks and face very well. "Sir," she sighed, "as you like. In a bit, the room will be warmer." He made no answer, and had turned his face away from her again. And Mrs. Hall, feeling that her conversational advances were ill-timed, laid the rest of the table things in a quick staccato and whisked out of the room. When she returned, he was still standing there, like a man of stone, his back hunched, his collar turned up, his dripping hat brim turned down, hiding his face and ears completely. He put down the eggs and bacon with considerable emphasis, and called rather than said to him, "Your lunch is served, sir." "Thank you," he said at the same time, and did not stir until she was closing the door. Then he swung round and approached the table with a certain eager quickness. As she went behind the bar to the kitchen, she heard a sound repeated at regular intervals. Chirk, 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 it went. The sound of a spoon being rapidly whisked round a basin. "That girl," she said there. "I clean forgot it. It's her being so long." And while she herself finished mixing the mustard, she gave Milly a few verbal stabs for her excessive slowness. He had cooked the ham and eggs, laid the table, and done everything, while Milly, help indeed, had only succeeded in delaying the mustard. And him, a new guest, and wanting to stay. Then she filled the mustard pot, and putting it with a certain stateliness upon a gold and black tea tray, carried it into the parlor. She rapped and entered promptly. As she did so, her visitor moved quickly, so that she got but a glimpse of a white object disappearing behind the table. It would seem he was picking something from the floor. She rapped down the mustard pot on the table, and then she noticed the overcoat and hat had been taken off and put over a chair in front of the fire, and a pair of wet boots threatened rust to her steel fender. She went to these things resolutely. "Suppose I may have them to dry now," she said in a voice that brooked no denial. "Leave the hat," said her visitor in a muffled voice, and turning she saw he had raised his head and was sitting and looking at her. For a moment she stood gaping at him, too surprised to speak. He held a white cloth, it was a serviette he had brought with him, over the lower part of his face, so that his mouth and jaws were completely hidden, and that was the reason of his muffled voice. It was not that which startled Mrs. Hall. It was the fact that all his forehead above his blue glasses was covered by a white bandage, and that another covered his ears, leaving not a scrap of his face exposed excepting only his pink-peaked nose. It was bright, pink, and shiny just as it had been at first. He wore a dark brown velvet jacket with a high, black, linen-lined collar turned up about his neck. The thick black hair, escaping as it could below and between the cross bandages, projected in curious tails and horns, giving him the strangest appearance conceivable. This muffled and bandaged head was so unlike what she had anticipated that for a moment she was rigid. He did not remove the serviette, but remained holding it, as she saw now, with a brown gloved hand, and regarding her with his inscrutable blue glasses sleeve. "The hat," he said, speaking very distinctly through the white cloth. Her nerves began to recover from the shock they had received. She placed the hat on the chair again by the fire. "He didn't know, sir," she began, "that," and she stopped, embarrassed. "Thank you," he said dryly, glancing from her to the door and then at her again. "You'll have them nicely dried, sir." "At once," she said, and carried his clothes out of the room. She glanced at his white, swathed head and blue goggles again as she was going out of the door, but his napkin was still in front of his face. He shivered a little as she closed the door behind her, and her face was eloquent of her surprise and perplexity. "Never," she whispered there. She went quite softly to the kitchen, and was too preoccupied to ask Milly what she was messing about with now when she got there. The visitor sat and listened to her retreating feet. He glanced inquiringly at the window before he removed his serviette and resumed his meal. He took a mouthful, glanced suspiciously at the window, took another mouthful, then rose, and taking the serviette in his hand, walked across the room and pulled the blind down to the top of the white muslin that obscured the lower panes. This left the room in a twilight. This done, he returned with an easier air to the table, and his mouth, poor souls, had an accident or an oppression or something. Said Mrs. Hall, "What a turn them bandages did give me." To be sure, she put on some more coal, unfolded the clothes horse, and extended the traveler's coat upon they goggles. Why, he looked more like a divin' helmet than a human man. She hung his muffler on a corner of the horse and holding that handkerchief over his mouth all the time, talking through it. Perhaps his mouth was hurt too. Maybe she turned round, as one who suddenly remembers. "Bless my soul alive," she said, "ain't you done them taters yet, Milly?" when Mrs. Hall went to clear away the stranger's lunch. Her idea that his mouth must also have been cut or disfigured in the accident she supposed him to have suffered was confirmed, for he was smoking a pipe, and all the time that she was in the room he never loosened the silk muffler he had wrapped round the lower part of his face to put the mouthpiece to his lips. Going off at a tangent, yet it was not forgetfulness, for she saw he glanced at it as it smoldered out. He sat in the corner with his back to the window blind and spoke now, having eaten and drunk and being comfortably warmed through, with less aggressive brevity than before. The reflection of the fire lent a kind of red animation to his big spectacles. They had lacked hitherto have some luggage, he said, at Bramblehurst station, and he asked her how he could have it sent. He bowed his bandaged head quite politely in acknowledgment of her explanation tomorrow. He said there is no speedier delivery, and seemed quite disappointed when she answered. No, was she quite sure? No man with a trap who would go over. Mrs. Hall, nothing loath, answered his questions and developed a conversation. It's a steep road by the Downs, sir. she said in answer to the question about a trap. And then, snatching at an opening, said, "It was there. A carriage was upsettled a year ago and more. A gentleman killed, besides his coachman. Accidents, sir, happen in a moment, don't they? But the visitor was not to be drawn so easily, they do," he said through his muffler, eyeing her quietly through his impenetrable glasses. "But they take long enough to get well, don't they? There was my sister's son, Tom, just cut his arm with a scythe, tumbled on it in the hay-field, and, bless me, he was 3 months tied up, sir. You'd hardly believe it." "It's regular giving me a dread of a scythe, sir, I can quite understand that," said the visitor. He was afraid one time that he'd have to have an operation. "He was that bad, sir," the visitor laughed abruptly. A bark of a laugh that he seemed to bite and kill in his mouth was. He said he was, sir, and no laughing matter to them as had the doing for him, as I had, my sister being took up with her little ones so much. There was bandages to do, sir, and bandages to undo, so that if I may make so bold as to say it, sir, will you get me some matches?" said the visitor, quite abruptly. "Pipe is out." Mrs. Hall was pulled up suddenly. It was certainly rude of him, after telling him all she had done. She gasped at him for a moment, and remembered the 2 sovereigns. "She went for the matches, thanks," he said concisely, as she put them down, and turned his shoulder upon her, and stared out of the window again. It was altogether too discouraging. Evidently he was sensitive on the topic of operations and bandages. He did not make so bold as to say, however, after all. But his snubbing way had irritated her, and Milly had a hot time of it that afternoon. The visitor remained in the parlor until 4 o'clock, without giving the ghost of an excuse for an intrusion. For the most part he was quite still during that time. It would seem he sat in the growing darkness, smoking in the firelight, perhaps dozing. Once or twice a curious listener might have heard him at the coals, and for the space of 5 minutes he was audible pacing the room. He seemed to be talking to himself. Then the armchair creaked as he sat down again. Chapter 2. Mr. Teddy Henfrey's first impressions. At 4 o'clock, when it was fairly dark, and Mrs. Hall was screwing up her courage to go in and ask her visitor if he would take some tea, Teddy Henfrey, the clock jobber, came into the barmy sakes. "Mrs. Hall," said he, "but this is terrible weather for thin boots. The snow outside was falling faster." Mrs. Hall agreed, and then noticed he had his bag with him now. "You're here, Mr. Teddy," said she. "I'd be glad if you'd give the old clock in the parlor a bit of a look. 'Tis going, and it strikes well and hearty. But the hour hand won't do nothin' but point at 6 and leading the way." She went across to the parlor door and rapped and entered. Her visitor, she saw as she opened the door, was seated in the armchair before the fire, dozing it would seem, with his bandaged head drooping on one side. The only light in the room was the red glow from the fire, which lit his eyes like adverse railway signals, but left his downcast face in darkness, and the scanty vestiges of the day that came in through the open door. Everything was ruddy, shadowy, and indistinct to her, the more so since she had just been lighting the bar lamp, and her eyes were dazzled. For a second, it seemed to her that the man she looked at had an enormous mouth wide open, a vast and incredible mouth that swallowed the whole of the lower portion of his face. It was the sensation of a moment, the white-bound head, the monstrous goggle eyes, and this huge yawn below it. Then he stirred, started up in his chair, put up his hand. She opened the door wide so that the room was lighter, and she saw him more clearly, with the muffler held up to his face just as she had seen him hold the serviette before. The shadows, she fancied, had tricked her. "Would you mind, sir, this man a-coming to look at the clock?" "Sir?" she said, recovering from the momentary shock. "Look at the clock," he said, staring round in a drowsy manner, and speaking over his hand, and then, getting more fully awake, certainly Mrs. Hall went away to get a lamp. And he rose and stretched himself. Then came the light, and Mr. Teddy Henfrey, entering, was confronted by this bandaged person. He was, he says, taken aback. "Good afternoon," said the stranger, regarding him, as Mr. Henfrey says, with a vivid sense of the dark spectacles. "Like a lobster, I hope," said Mr. Henfrey. "That it's no intrusion, none whatever," said the stranger, though. "I understand," he said, turning to Mrs. Hall, "that this room is really to be mine for my own private use, I thought." "Sir," said Mrs. Hall, "you'd prefer the clock?" "Certainly," said the stranger. "But as a rule, I like to be alone and undisturbed. But I'm really glad to have the clock seen to," he said, seeing a certain hesitation in Mr. Henfrey's manœuvre, glad Mr. Henfrey had intended to apologize and withdraw. But this anticipation reassured him. The stranger turned round with his back to the fireplace and put his hands behind his back, and presently he said, "When the clock mending is over, I think I should like to have some tea." But not till the clock mending is over. Mrs. Hall was about to leave the room. She made no conversational advances this time, because she did not want to be snubbed in front of Mr. Henfrey, when her visitor asked her if she had made any arrangements about his boxes at Bramblehurst. She told him she had mentioned the matter to the postman, and that the carrier could bring them over on the morrow. "You are certain that is the earliest?" he said. He was certain, with a marked coldness he should explain. He added, "What I was really too cold and fatigued to do before." "That I am an experimental investigator indeed, sir," said Mrs. Hall, much impressed, "and my baggage contains apparatus and appliances, very useful things indeed they are." "Sir," said Mrs. Howland, "I'm very naturally anxious to get on with my inquiries, of course. Sir, my reason for coming to Iping," he proceeded, with a certain deliberation of manner, "was a desire for solitude. I do not wish to be disturbed in my work. In addition to my work, an accident, I thought as much," said Mrs. Hall to herself, "necessitates a certain retirement. My eyes are sometimes so weak and painful that I have to shut myself up in the dark for hours together. Lock myself up. Sometimes, now and then. Not at present, certainly. At such times the slightest disturbance, the entry of a stranger into the room, is a source of excruciating annoyance to me. It is well these things should be understood, certainly." "Sir," said Mrs. Howland, "if I might make so bold as to ask, that I think is all," said the stranger, with that quietly irresistible air of finality he could assume at will. Mrs. Hall reserved her question and sympathy for a better occasion. After Mrs. Hall had left the room, he remained standing in front of the fire, glaring, so Mr. Henfrey puts it, at the clock mending. Mr. Henfrey not only took off the hands of the clock and the face, but extracted the works, and he tried to work in as slow and quiet and unassuming a manner as possible. He worked with the lamp close to him, and the green shade threw a brilliant light upon his hands and upon the frame and wheels, and left the rest of the room shadowy. When he looked up, colored patches swam in his eyes. Being constitutionally of a curious nature, he had removed the works, a quite unnecessary proceeding, with the idea of delaying his departure and perhaps falling into conversation with the stranger. But the stranger stood there perfectly silent and still. So still, it got on Henfrey's nerves. He felt alone in the room and looked up, and there, gray and dim, was the bandaged head and huge blue lenses staring fixedly, with a mist of green spots drifting in front of them. It was so uncanny to Henfrey that for a minute they remained staring blankly at one another. Then Henfrey looked down again. Very uncomfortable position. One would like to say something. Should he remark that the weather was very cold for the time of year? He looked up as if to take aim with that introductory shot. "The weather," he began. "Why don't you finish and go?" said the rigid figure, evidently in a state of painfully suppressed ragul. You've got to do is to fix the hour hand on its axle. You're simply humbugging. Certainly, sir. 1 minute more. I overlooked, and Mr. Henfrey finished and went. But he went feeling excessively annoyed, damn it, said Mr. Henfrey to himself, trudging down the village through the thawing snow. A man must do a clock at times, surely. And again, can a man look at you? Ugly, and yet, again. If the police was wanting you, you couldn't be more wropped and bandaged at Gleason's corner. He saw Hall, who had recently married the stranger's hostess at the Coach and Horses, and who now drove the Iping conveyance, when occasional people required it, to Sidderbridge Junction, coming towards him on his return from that place. Hall had evidently been stopping a bit at Sidderbridge, to judge by his driving. "Oh, do, Teddy," he said. "Passingio got a rum un up home," said Teddy. Hall very sociably pulled up. "What's that?" he asked Edrum, looking customer, stopping at the Coach and Horses. Said Teddy, "Me sakes," and he proceeded to give Hall a vivid description of his grotesque guest looks. "A bit like a disguise, don't it? I'd like to see a man's face if I had him stopping in my place," said Henfrey, "but women are that trustful where strangers are concerned." "He's took your rooms, and he ain't even given a name, Hall." "You don't say so," said Hall, who was a man of sluggish apprehension. Said Teddy B. the weak. "Whatever he is, you can't get rid of him under the week. And he's got a lot of luggage coming tomorrow, so he says." "Let's hope it won't be stones in boxes," Hawley told Hall how his aunt at Hastings had been swindled by a stranger with empty portmanteau. Altogether he left Hall vaguely suspicious. "Get up, old girl," said Hallie. "Suppose I must see about this." Teddy trudged on his way with his mind considerably relieved. Instead of seeing about it, however, Hall on his return was severely rated by his wife on the length of time he had spent in Sidderbridge, and his mild inquiries were answered snappishly, and in a manner not to the point. But the seed of suspicion Teddy had sown germinated in the mind of Mr. Hall. In spite of these discouragements, "You women don't know everything," said Mr. Hall, resolved to ascertain more about the personality of his guest at the earliest possible opportunity. And after the stranger had gone to bed, which he did about 9:30, Mr. Hall went very aggressively into the parlor and looked very hard at his wife's furniture, just to show that the stranger wasn't master there, and scrutinized closely and a little contemptuously a sheet of mathematical computations the stranger had left. When retiring for the night, he instructed Mrs. Hall to look very closely at the stranger's luggage when it came next day. "You mind your own business, Hall," said Mrs. Hall, and "I'll mind mine." She was all the more inclined to snap at Hall because the stranger was undoubtedly an unusually strange sort of stranger, and she was by no means assured about him in her own mind. In the middle of the night, she woke up dreaming of huge white heads like turnips that came trailing after her at the end of interminable necks and with vast black eyes. But, being a sensible woman, she subdued her terrors and turned over and went to sleep again. Chapter 3. 1001 Bottles. So it was that on the 29th day of February, at the beginning of the thaw, this singular person fell out of infinity into Iping village. Next day his luggage arrived through the slush, and very remarkable luggage it was. There were a couple of trunks indeed, such as a rational man might need. But in addition, there were a box of books. Big, fat books, of which some were just in an incomprehensible handwriting, and a dozen or more crates, boxes, and cases, containing objects packed in straw, as it seemed to Hall, tugging with a casual curiosity at the straw. Glass bottles. The stranger, muffled in hat, coat, gloves, and wrapper, came out impatiently to meet Fearenside's cart, while Hall was having a word or so of gossip preparatory to helping bring them in. Out he came, not noticing Fearenside's dog, who was sniffing in a dilettante spirit at Hall's legs come along with those boxes. He said I'd been waiting long enough, and he came down the steps towards the tail of the cart, as if to lay hands on the smaller crate. No sooner had Fearenside's dog caught sight of him, however, than it began to bristle and growl savagely, and when he rushed down the steps it gave an undecided hop, and then sprang straight at his hand-whip, cried Hall, jumping back, for he was no hero with dogs, and Fearenside howled, "Lie down," and snatched his whip. They saw the dog's teeth had slipped the hand, heard a kick, saw the dog execute a flanking jump and get home on the stranger's leg, and heard the rip of his trousering. Then the finer end of Fearenside's whip reached his property, and the dog, yelping with dismay, retreated under the wheels of the wagon. It was all the business of a swift half-minute. No one spoke, everyone shouted. The stranger glanced swiftly at his torn glove and at his leg, made as if he would stoop to the ladder, then turned and rushed swiftly up the steps into the inn. They heard him go headlong across the passage and up the uncarpeted stairs to his bedroom. "You brute," "You," said Fearenside, climbing off the wagon with his whip in his hand, while the dog watched him through the wheel. "Come here," said Fearenside. "You'd better Hall had stood gapping he was bit," said Hallied. "Better go and see to N." And he trotted after the stranger. He met Mrs. Hall in the passage carrier's darg. He said, "Bid it." He went straight upstairs, and the stranger's door being ajar, he pushed it open and was entering without any ceremony, being of a naturally sympathetic turn of mind. The blind was down, and the room dim. He caught a glimpse of a most singular thing, what seemed a handless arm waving towards him, and a face of 3 huge indeterminate spots on white, very like the face of a pale pansy. Then he was struck violently in the chest, hurled back, and the door slammed in his face and locked. It was so rapid that it gave him no time to observe. A waving of indecipherable shapes, a blow, and a concussion. There he stood on the dark little landing, wondering what it might be that he had seen. A couple of minutes after, he rejoined the little group that had formed outside the coach and horses. There was Fearenside telling about it all over again for the second time. There was Mrs. Hall saying his dog didn't have no business to bite her guests. There was Huckster, the general dealer from over the road. Interrogative. Besides women and children, all of them saying fatuities. "Wouldn't let 'un bite me, I knows. What he bitin' for then," so forth. And Sandy Wodgers from the Forge Judicial. "Doesn't right have such darks." Mr. Hall, staring at them from the steps and listening, found it incredible that he had seen anything so very remarkable happen upstairs. Besides, his vocabulary was altogether too limited to express his impressions. "Don't want no help, he says," he said in answer to his wife's inquiry. "Better be a-taken of his luggage, and he ought to have it cauterized at once," said Mr. Huckster. "Especially if it's at all inflamed, I'd shoot in. That's what I'd do," said a lady in the group. Suddenly the dog began growling again. "Come along," cried an angry voice in the doorway, and there stood the muffled stranger with his collar turned up, and his hat brim bent down. "The sooner you get those things in the better. I'll be pleased it is stated by an anonymous bystander that his trousers and gloves had been changed was you heard." "Sir," said Fearensidim rare. "Sorry the dog? Not a bit," said the stranger. "Neighbor broke the skin. Hurry up with those things," he then swore to himself. So Mr. Hall asserts. Directly the first crate was, in accordance with his directions, carried into the parlor, the stranger flung himself upon it with extraordinary eagerness, and began to unpack it, scattering the straw with an utter disregard of Mrs. Hall's carpet. And from it he began to produce bottles, Little fat bottles containing powders, small and slender bottles containing colored and white fluids. Fluted blue bottles labeled poison, bottles with round bodies and slender necks, large green glass bottles, large white glass bottles. Bottles with glass, stoppers and frosted labels, bottles with fine corks, bottles with bungs, bottles with wooden caps. Wine bottles, salad oil bottles, putting them in rows, on the chiffonier, on the mantel, on the table under the window, down the floor, on the bookshelf, everywhere. The chemist's shop in Bramblehurst could not boast half so many. Quite a sight it was. Crate after crate yielded bottles, until all 6 were empty, and the table high with straw. The only things that came out of these crates besides the bottles were a number of test tubes and a carefully packed balance. And directly the crates were unpacked, the stranger went to the window and set to work, not troubling in the least about the litter of straw, the fire which had gone out, the box of books outside, nor for the trunks and other luggage that had gone upstairs. When Mrs. Hall took his dinner into him, he was already so absorbed in his work, pouring little drops out of the bottles into test tubes. He did not hear her until she had swept away the bulk of the straw and put the tray on the table, with some little emphasis perhaps, seeing the state that the floor was in. Then he half turned his head and immediately turned it away again. But she saw he had removed his glasses. They were beside him on the table, and it seemed to her that his eye sockets were extraordinarily hollow. He put on his spectacles again and then turned and faced her. He was about to complain of the straw on the floor when he anticipated Harry wished she wouldn't come in without knocking. He said in the tone of abnormal exasperation that seemed so characteristic of him, he knocked, but seemingly, perhaps you did. But in my investigations, my really very urgent and necessary investigations, the slightest disturbance, the jar of a door, I must ask you. Certainly, sir. You can turn the lock if you're like that, you know. Any time a very good idea, said the stranger this drawer. Sir, if I might make so bold as to remark, don't. If the straw makes trouble, put it down in the bill, and he mumbled at her, words suspiciously like curses. He was so odd standing there, so aggressive and explosive, bottle in one hand and test tube in the other, that Mrs. Hall was quite alarmed. But she was a resolute woman, in which case I should like to know, sir, what you consider. A shilling. Put down a shilling. Surely a shilling's enough, so be it, said Mrs. Hall, taking up the tablecloth and beginning to spread it over the table. If you're satisfied, of course. He turned and sat down, with his coat collar toward her. All the afternoon he worked with the door locked and, as Mrs. Hall testifies, for the most part in silence. Once there was a concussion and a sound of bottles ringing together, as though the table had been hit, and the smash of a bottle flung violently down, and then a rapid pacing athwart the room. Hearing something was the matter, she went to the door and listened. Not caring to knocky, can't go on. He was revengey, can't go on. 300,000, 400,000. The huge multitude. Heated. All my life it may take me. Patience. Patience indeed. Fool. Fool. There was a noise of hobnails on the bricks in the bar, and Mrs. Hall had very reluctantly to leave the rest of his soliloquy. When she returned, the room was silent again, save for the faint crepitation of his chair and the occasional clink of a bottle. It was all over. The stranger had resumed work. When she took in his tea, she saw a broken glass in the corner of the room under the concave mirror, and a golden stain that had been carelessly wiped. She called attention to it, put it down in the bill. Snapped her visitor, for God's sake, don't worry me. There's damage done, put it down in the bill. And he went on ticking a list in the exercise book. Before him, he'll tell you something, said Fear inside, mysteriously. It was late in the afternoon, and they were in the little beer shop of Iping Hangerwell. Said Teddy Henfrey, "This chap you're speaking of, what my dog bit. Well, he's black. Leastways, his legs are. I seed through the tear of his trousers and the tear of his glove. You'd have expected a sort of pinky to show, wouldn't you? Well, there wasn't none. Just blackness. I tell you, he's as black as my hat." "My sakes," said Henfrey, "it's a rummy case altogether." "Why, his nose is as pink as paint, that's true," said Firencide knows that. "And I tell 'ee what I'm thinking. That marn's a piebald, Teddy. Black here and white there, in patches. And he's ashamed of it. He's a kind of half-breed, and the colors come off patchy instead of mixing. I've heard of such things before, and it's the common way with horses, as anyone can see." Chapter 4. Mr. Cuss interviews the stranger. I have told the circumstances of the stranger's arrival in Iping with a certain fullness of detail, in order that the curious impression he created may be understood by the reader. But excepting two odd incidents, the circumstances of his stay, until the extraordinary day of the club festival, may be passed over very cursorily. There were a number of skirmishes with Mrs. Hall on matters of domestic discipline, but in every case until late April, when the first signs of penury began, he overrode her by the easy expedient of an extra payment. Hall did not like him, and whenever he dared he talked of the advisability of getting rid of him. But he showed his dislike chiefly by concealing it ostentatiously, and avoiding his visitor as much as possible. "Wait till the summer," said Mrs. Hall sagely, "when the artists are beginning to come. Then we'll see. He may be a bit overbearing, but Bill's settled punctual is Bill's settled punctual. Whatever you'd like to say, the stranger did not go to church, and indeed made no difference between Sunday and the irreligious days, even in costume. He worked, as Mrs. Hall thought, very fitfully. Some days he would come down early and be continuously busy. On others he would rise late, pace his room, fretting audibly for hours together, smoke, sleep in the armchair by the fire. Communication with the world beyond the village he had none. His temper continued very uncertain. For the most part his manner was that of a man suffering under almost unendurable provocation, and once or twice things were snapped, torn, crushed, or broken in spasmodic gusts of violence. He seemed under a chronic irritation of the greatest intensity. His habit of talking to himself in a low voice grew steadily upon him, but though Mrs. Hall listened conscientiously, she could make neither head nor tail of what she heard. He rarely went abroad by daylight, but at twilight he would go out muffled up invisibly, whether the weather were cold or not, and he chose the loneliest paths and those most overshadowed by trees and banks. His goggling spectacles and ghastly bandaged face under the penthouse of his hat came with a disagreeable suddenness out of the darkness upon one or two home-going laborers. And Teddy Henfrey, tumbling out of the scarlet coat one night at 9:30, was scared shamefully by the stranger's skull-like head. He was walking hat in hand, lit by the sudden light of the opened-in door. Such children as saw him at nightfall dreamt of bogies, and it seemed doubtful whether he disliked boys more than they disliked him, or the reverse. But there was certainly a vivid enough dislike on either side. It was inevitable that a person of so remarkable an appearance and bearing should form a frequent topic in such a village as Iping. Opinion was greatly divided about his occupation. Mrs. Hall was sensitive on the point. When questioned, she explained very carefully that he was an experimental investigator, going gingerly over the syllables as one who dreads pitfalls. When asked what an experimental investigator was, she would say with a touch of superiority that most educated people knew such things as that, and would thus explain that he discovered things her visitor had had an accident, she said, which temporarily discolored his face and hands. And being of a sensitive disposition, he was averse to any public notice of the fact. Out of her hearing there was a view largely entertained that he was a criminal, trying to escape from justice by wrapping himself up This idea sprang from the brain of Mr. Teddy Henfrey. No crime of any magnitude dating from the middle or end of February was known to have occurred. Elaborated in the imagination of Mr. Gould, the probationary assistant in the National School, this theory took the form that the stranger was an anarchist in disguise, preparing explosives, and he resolved to undertake such detective operations as his time permitted. These consisted, for the most part, in looking very hard at the stranger whenever they met, or in asking people who had never seen the stranger, leading questions about him. But he detected nothing. Another school of opinion followed Mr. Fearendside, and either accepted the piebald view or some modification of it, as, for instance, Silas Durgan, who was heard to assert that if he chooses to show himself at fairs he'd make his fortune in no time, and being a bit of a theologian, compared the stranger to the man with the one talent. Yet another view explained the entire matter by regarding the stranger as a harmless lunatic. That had the advantage of accounting for everything straight away. Between these main groups there were waverers and compromisers. Sussex folk have few superstitions, and it was only after the events of early April that the thought of the supernatural was first whispered in the village. Even then, it was only credited among the women folk. Whatever they thought of him, people in Iping, on the whole, agreed in disliking him. His irritability, though it might have been comprehensible to an urban brain worker, was an amazing thing to these quiet Sussex villagers. The frantic gesticulations they surprised now and then, the headlong pace after nightfall that swept him upon them round quiet corners, the inhuman bludgeoning of all tentative advances of curiosity, the taste for twilight that led to the closing of doors, the pulling down of blinds, the extinction of candles and lamps. Who could agree with such goings-on? He drew aside as he passed down the village, and when he had gone by, young humorists would up with coat collars and down with hat brims, and go pacing nervously after him, in imitation of his occult bearing. There was a song popular at that time called The Bogey Man. Miss Stachel sang it at the schoolroom concert, in aid of the church lamps, and thereafter, whenever one or two of the villagers were gathered together and the stranger appeared, a bar or so of this tune, more or less sharp or flat, was whistled in the midst of them. Also belated little children would call Bogey Man after him, and make off tremulously elated. Cuss, the general practitioner, was devoured by curiosity. The bandages excited his professional interest. The report of the 1,001 bottles aroused his jealous regard. All through April and May he coveted an opportunity of talking to the stranger, and at last, towards Whitsuntide, he could stand it no longer, but hit upon the subscription list for a village nurse as an excuse. He was surprised to find that Mr. Hall did not know his guest's name. He gave a name, said Mrs. Hall, an assertion which was quite unfounded. But I didn't rightly hear it. She thought it seemed so silly not to know the man's name. Cuss rapped at the parlor door and entered. There was a fairly audible imprecation from within. "Pardon my intrusion," said Cuss, and then the door closed and cut Mrs. Hall off from the rest of the conversation. He could hear the murmur of voices for the next 10 minutes, then a cry of surprise, a stirring of feet, a chair flung aside, a bark of laughter, quick steps to the door, and Cuss appeared, his face white, his eyes staring over his shoulder. He left the door open behind him, and without looking at her, strode across the hall and went down the steps, and she heard his feet hurrying along the road. He carried his hat in his hand. She stood behind the door, looking at the open door of the parlor. Then she heard the stranger laughing quietly, and then his footsteps came across the room. She could not see his face where she stood. The parlor door slammed, and the place was silent again. Cuss went straight up the village to Bunting the Vicarum. "I mad Cuss," began abruptly, as he entered the shabby little study. "Do I look like an insane person?" "What's happened?" said the vicar, putting the ammonite on the loose sheets of his forthcoming sermon. "That chap at the inn?" "Well, give me something to drink," said Cuss, and he sat down. When his nerves had been steadied by a glass of cheap sherry, the only drink the good vicar had available. He told him of the interview he had just had. Went in. He gasped and began to demand a subscription for that nurse fund. He'd stuck his hands in his pockets as I came in, and he sat down lumpily in his chair. I sniffed. I told him I'd heard he took an interest in scientific things. He said yes. Sniffed again. Kept on sniffing all time, evidently recently caught an infernal cold. No wonder, wrapped up like that. I'd developed the nurse idea, and all the while kept my eyes open. Bottles, chemicals, everywhere. Balance, test tubes and stands, and a smell of evening primrose. Would he subscribe? Said he'd consider it. Asked him, point blank, was he researching? Said he was. A long research? Got quite cross. A damnable long research. Said he, blowing the cork out. So to speak? Oh, said I. And out came the grievance. The man was just on the boil, and my question boiled him over. He had been given a prescription. Most valuable prescription. What for he wouldn't say. Was it medical? Damn you. What are you fishing after? I apologized. Dignified sniff and cough. He resumed. He'd read it. 5 ingredients. Put it down, turned his head. Draught of air from window lifted the paper. Swish, rustle. He was working in a room with an open fireplace, he said. Saw a flicker, and there was the prescription, burning and lifting chimneyward. Rushed towards it just as it whisked up the chimney. Just at that point, to illustrate his story, out came his arm, well, no hand, just an empty sleeve. Lord Dottie, I thought, that's a deformity. Got a cork arm, I suppose, and has taken it off. Then I thought, there's something odd in that. What the devil keeps that sleeve up and open if there's nothing in it? There was nothing in it, I tell you. Nothing down it, right down to the joint. I could see right down it to the elbow, and there was a glimmer of light shining through a tear of the cloth. Good God, I said. Then he stopped, stared at me with those black goggles of his, and then at his sleeve. Well, that's all. He never said a word, just glared and put his sleeve back in his pocket quickly. I was saying, said he, that there was the prescription burning, wasn't I? Interrogative cough. How the devil, said I. Can you move an empty sleeve like that? Empty sleeve? Yes, said I. An empty sleeve? It's an empty sleeve. Is it? You saw it was an empty sleeve? He stood up right away. I stood up too. He came towards me in 3 very slow steps and stood quite close. Sniffed venomously. I didn't flinch, though I'm hanged if that bandaged knob of his and those blinkers aren't enough to unnerve anyone. Coming quietly up to you. You said it was an empty sleeve, he said. Certainly, I said. At staring and saying nothing, a barefaced man, unspectacled. Start scratch. Then very quietly he pulled his sleeve out of his pocket again and raised his arm towards me as though he would show it to me again. He did it very, very slowly. I looked at it. Seemed an age. Well, said I, clearing my throat, there's nothing in it. Had to say something. I was beginning to feel frightened. I could see right down it. He extended it straight towards me. Slowly, slowly, just like that, until the cuff was 6 inches from my face. Queer thing to see an empty sleeve come at you like that. And then, well, something. Exactly like a finger and thumb it felt, nipped my nose. Bunting began to laugh. There wasn't anything there, said Cuss, his voice running up into a shriek at the there. It's all very well for you to laugh, but I tell you I was so startled, I hit his cuff hard and turned around and cut out of the room. I left him. Cuss stopped. There was no mistaking the sincerity of his panic. He turned round in a helpless way and took a second glass of the excellent Vickers' very inferior sherry. When I hit his cuff, said Cuss, I tell you, it felt exactly like hitting an arm. And there wasn't an arm. There wasn't the ghost of an arm. Mr. Bunting thought it over. He looked suspiciously at Cuss. It's a most remarkable story, he said. He looked very wise and grave. Indeed, it's really, said Mr. Bunting with judicial emphasis, a most remarkable story. Chapter 5. The Burglary at the Vicarage. The facts of the burglary at the vicarage came to us chiefly through the medium of the vicar and his wife. It occurred in the small hours of Whit Monday, the day devoted in Iping to the club festivities. Mrs. Bunting, it seems, woke up suddenly in the stillness that comes before the dawn, with the strong impression that the door of their bedroom had opened and closed. She did not arouse her husband at first, but sat up in bed listening. She then distinctly heard the pad of bare feet coming out of the adjoining dressing room and walking along the passage towards the staircase. As soon as she felt assured of this, she aroused the Reverend Mr. Bunting as quietly as possible. He did not strike a light, but putting on his spectacles, her dressing gown, and his bath slippers, he went out on the landing to listen. He heard quite distinctly a fumbling going on at his study desk downstairs, and then a violent sneeze. At that he returned to his bedroom, armed himself with the most obvious weapon, the poker, and descended the staircase as noiselessly as possible. Mrs. Bunting came out on the landing. The hour was about 4, and the ultimate darkness of the night was past. There was a faint shimmer of light in the hall, but the study doorway yawned impenetrably black. Everything was still except the faint creaking of the stairs under Mr. Bunting's tread, and the slight movements in the study. Then something snapped. The drawer was opened, and there was a rustle of papers. Then came an imprecation, and a match was struck, and the study was flooded with yellow light. Mr. Bunting was now in the hall, and through the crack of the door he could see the desk and the open drawer, and a candle burning on the desk. But the robber he could not see. He stood there in the hall, undecided what to do, and Mrs. Bunting, her face white and intent, crept slowly downstairs after him. One thing kept Mr. Bunting's courage: the persuasion that this burglar was a resident in the village. They heard the chink of money and realized that the robber had found the housekeeping reserve of gold, £2 10½ sovereigns altogether. At that sound, Mr. Bunting was nerved to abrupt action. Gripping the poker firmly, he rushed into the room, closely followed by Mrs. Bunting's surrender. Cried Mr. Bunting fiercely, and then stooped amazed. Apparently, the room was perfectly empty. Yet, their conviction that they had, that very moment, heard somebody moving in the room had amounted to a certainty. For half a minute, perhaps, they stood gaping. Then Mrs. Bunting went across the room and looked behind the screen, while Mr. Bunting, by a kindred impulse, peered under the desk. Then Mrs. Bunting turned back the window curtains, and Mr. Bunting looked up the chimney and probed it with the poker. Then Mrs. Bunting scrutinized the waste-paper basket, and Mr. Bunting opened the lid of the coal scuttle. Then they came to a stop and stood with eyes interrogating each other. Could have sworn. Said Mr. Bunting. The candle, said Mr. Bunting. Who lit the candle? The drawer said. They rushed out, and as they did so, the kitchen door slammed. Bring the candle, said Mr. Bunting, and led the way. They both heard a sound of bolts being hastily shot back. As he opened the kitchen door, he saw through the scullery that the back door was just opening, and the faint light of early dawn displayed the dark masses of the garden beyond. He is certain that nothing went out of the door. It opened, stood open for a moment, and then closed with a slam. As it did so, the candle Mrs. Bunting was carrying from the study flickered and flared. It was a minute or more before they entered the kitchen. The place was empty. They refastened the back door, examined the kitchen, pantry, and scullery thoroughly, and at last went down into the cellar. There was not a soul to be found in the house, search as they would. Daylight found the vicar and his wife, a quaintly costumed little couple, still marveling about on their own ground floor by the unnecessary light of a guttering candle. Chapter 6. The Furniture That Went Mad. Now it happened that in the early hours of Whit Monday, before Milly was hunted out for the day, Mr. Hall and Mrs. Hall both rose and went noiselessly down into the cellar. Their business there was of a private nature, and had something to do with the specific gravity of their beer. They had hardly entered the cellar when Mrs. Hall found she had forgotten to bring down a bottle of sarsaparilla from their joint room. As she was the expert and principal operator in this affair, Hall very properly went upstairs for it. On the landing he was surprised to see that the stranger's door was ajar. He went on into his own room and found the bottle as he had been directed. But returning with the bottle, he noticed that the bolts of the front door had been shot back, that the door was in fact simply on the latch. And with a flash of inspiration he connected this with the stranger's room upstairs and the suggestions of Mr. Teddy Henfrey. Distinctly remembered holding the candle while Mrs. Hall shot these bolts overnight. At the sight, he stopped, gaping, then with the bottle still in his hand, went upstairs again. He rapped at the stranger's door. There was no answer. He rapped again, then pushed the door wide open and entered. It was as he expected. The bed, the room also, was empty. And what was stranger, even to his heavy intelligence, on the bedroom chair and along the rail of the bed were scattered the garments, the only garments so far as he knew, and the bandages of their guest. His big slouch hat even was cocked jauntily over the bedpost. As Hall stood there, he heard his wife's voice coming out of the depth of the cellar, with that rapid telescoping of the syllables and interrogative cocking up of the final words to a high note by which the West Sussex villager is wont to indicate a brisk impatience. George, you gart what a want at that. He turned and hurried down to her. Janny, he said, over the rail of the cellar steps. "'Tas the truth what Henfrey says. He's not in Usrum yet." And the front door is unbolted. At first Mrs. Hall did not understand, and as soon as she did, she resolved to see the empty room for herself. Hall, still holding the bottle, went for stiff. "Ain't there," he said. "Is close are. And what's he doin' ithout is close then?" "'Twas a most curious business. As they came up the cellar steps, they both, it was afterwards ascertained, fancied they heard the front door open and shut. But seeing it closed and nothing there, neither said a word to the other about it at the time. Mrs. Hall passed her husband in the passage and ran on first upstairs. Someone sneezed on the staircase. Hall, following 6 steps behind, thought that he heard her sneeze. She, going on first, was under the impression that Hall was sneezing. She flung open the door and stood regarding the room off all the curious, she said. He heard a sniff close behind her head as it seemed, and turning, was surprised to see Hall a dozen feet off on the topmost stair. But in another moment he was beside her. She bent forward and put her hand on the pillow and then under the clothes-gold. She said, "He's been up this hour or more." As she did so, a most extraordinary thing happened. The bedclothes gathered themselves together, leapt up suddenly into a sort of peak, and then jumped headlong over the bottom rail. It was exactly as if a hand had clutched them in the center and flung them aside. Immediately after, the stranger's hat hopped off the bedpost, described a whirling flight in the air through the better part of a circle, and then dashed straight at Mrs. Hall's face. Then, as swiftly came the sponge from the washstand, and then the chair, flinging the stranger's coat and trousers carelessly aside, and laughing dryly in a voice singularly like the stranger's, turned itself up with its 4 legs at Mrs. Hall, seemed to take aim at her for a moment, and charged at her. She screamed and turned, and then the chair legs came gently but firmly against her back and impelled her and Hall out of the room. The door slammed violently and was locked. The chair and bed seemed to be executing a dance of triumph for a moment, and then abruptly everything was still. Mrs. Hall was left almost in a fainting condition in Mr. Hall's arms on the landing. It was with the greatest difficulty that Mr. Hall and Milly, who had been roused by her scream of alarm, succeeded in getting her downstairs, and applying the restoratives customary in such cases. "Toss spirits," said Mrs. Howley. "No toss spirits. I've read in papers of tables and chairs leaping and dancing. Take a drop more, Janny," said Haltwell, steady. "You lock him out," said Mrs. Holden. "Let him come in again." I half guessed. I might ha' known. With them goggling eyes and bandaged head, and never going to church of a Sunday, and all they bottles, more'n it's right for anyone to have. He's put the spirits into the furniture, my good old furniture, as in that very chair my poor dear mother used to sit when I was a little girl. To think it should rise up against me now. Just a drop more, Janny," said Hallie. Her nerves is all upset. They sent Milly across the street through the golden 5 o'clock sunshine to rouse up Mr. Sandy Wadgers, the blacksmith. Mr. Hall's compliments, and the furniture upstairs was behaving most extraordinary. Would Mr. Wadgers come round? He was a knowing man, was Mr. Wadgers, and very resourceful. He took quite a grave view of the case. Armed, if that ain't witchcraft, was the view of Mr. Sandy Wadgers, who warn't horseshoes for such gentry as he came round greatly concerned. They wanted him to lead the way upstairs to the room, but he didn't seem to be in any hurry. He preferred to talk in the passage. Over the way, Huckster's apprentice came out and began taking down the shutters of the tobacco window. He was called over to join the discussion. Mr. Huckster naturally followed over in the course of a few minutes. The Anglo-Saxon genius for parliamentary government asserted itself. There was a great deal of talk, and no decisive action. "Let's have the facts first," insisted Mr. Sandy Wadgers. "Let's be sure we be acting perfectly right in bustin' that there door open. A door on bust is always open to bustin', but ye can't unbust a door once you've busted in." And suddenly, and most wonderfully, the door of the room upstairs opened of its own accord. As they looked up in amazement, they saw descending the stairs the muffled figure of the stranger, staring more blackly and blankly than ever with those unreasonably large blue glass eyes of his. He came down stiffly and slowly, staring all the time. He walked across the passage staring, then stopped. "Look there," he said, and their eyes followed the direction of his gloved finger and saw a bottle of sarsaparilla hard by the cellar door. Then he entered the parlor and suddenly, swiftly, viciously, slammed the door in their faces. Not a word was spoken until the last echoes of the slam had died away. They stared at one another. "Well, if that don't lick everything," said Mr. Wadgers, and left the alternative unsaid. He'd go in and ask him about it. Said Wadgers to Mr. Halley'd demand an explanation. It took some time to bring the landlady's husband up to that pitch. At last he rapped, opened the door, and got as far as, "Excuse me." "Go to the devil," said the stranger in a tremendous voice, "and shut that door after you." So that brief interview terminated. Chapter 7. The Unveiling of the Stranger. The stranger went into the little parlor of the Coach and Horses about 5:30 in the morning, and there he remained until near midday, the blinds down, the door shut, and none, after Hall's repulse, venturing near him. All that time he must have fasted. Thrice he rang his bell. the third time furiously and continuously. But no one answered him, and his "Go to the devil indeed," said Mrs. Hall. Presently came an imperfect rumor of the burglary at the vicarage, and two were put together. All, assisted by Wodgers, went off to find Mr. Shuckleforth, the magistrate, and take his advice. No one ventured upstairs. How the stranger occupied himself is unknown. Now and then he would stride violently up and down, and twice came an outburst of curses, a tearing of paper, and a violent smashing of bottles. The little group of scared but curious people increased. Mrs. Huckster came over. Some gay young fellows resplendent in black ready-made jackets and piqué paper ties, for it was Whit Monday, joined the group with confused interrogations. Young Archie Harker distinguished himself by going up the yard and trying to peep under the window blinds. He could see nothing, but gave reason for supposing that he did, and others of the Iping youth presently joined him. It was the finest of all possible Whit Mondays, and down the village street stood a row of nearly a dozen booths, a shooting gallery, and on the grass by the forge were 3 yellow and chocolate wagons, and some picturesque strangers of both sexes putting up a coconut shy. The gentlemen wore blue jerseys, the ladies white aprons and quite fashionable hats with heavy plumes. Roger of the Purple Fawn and Mr. Jaggers the cobbler, who also sold old second-hand ordinary bicycles, were stretching a string of Union Jacks and Royal Ensigns, which had originally celebrated the first Victorian Jubilee, across the road. And inside, in the artificial darkness of the parlor, into which only one thin jet of sunlight penetrated, the stranger, hungry we must suppose, and fearful, hidden in his uncomfortable hot wrappings, poured through his dark glasses upon his paper, or chinked his dirty little bottles, and occasionally swore savagely at the boys, audible if invisible, outside the windows. In the corner by the fireplace lay the fragments of half a dozen smashed bottles, and a pungent twang of chlorine tainted the air. So much we know from what was heard at the time, and from what was subsequently seen in the room. About noon he suddenly opened his parlor door and stood glaring fixedly at the 3 or 4 people in the Barmesers. "Hall," he said. Somebody went sheepishly and called for Mrs. Hall. Mrs. Hall appeared after an interval, a little short of breath, but all the fiercer for that. Hall was still out. He had deliberated over this scene, and she came holding a little tray with an unsettled bill upon itis. "It your bill you're wanting?" "Sir," she said, "why, wasn't my breakfast laid? Why haven't you prepared my meals and answered my bell? Do you think I live without eating? Why isn't my bill paid?" said Mrs. Hall-Adds. "What I want to know I told you 3 days ago. I was awaiting a remittance." "I told you 2 days ago. I wasn't going to await no remittances." "You can't grumble if your breakfast waits a bit. If my bill's been waiting these 5 days, can you?" The stranger swore briefly but vividly. "Nar from the Barand I'd thank you kindly, sir. If you'd keep your swearing to yourself, sir," said Mrs. Hall. The stranger stood looking more like an angry diving helmet than ever. It was universally felt in the bar that Mrs. Hall had the better of him. His next words showed as much. "Look here, my good woman. He began don't good woman me," said Mrs. Hallave. "Told you my remittance hasn't come." "Remittance, indeed," said Mrs. Hall still. "I dare say in my pocket. You told me 3 days ago that you hadn't anything but a sovereign's worth of silver upon you. Well, I've found some more. Old Low from the bar. I wonder where you found it," said Mrs. Hall. That seemed to annoy the stranger very much. He stamped his foot. "What do you mean?" he said. "That I wonder where you found it," said Mrs. Hallen. "Before I take any bills or get any breakfasts, or do any such things whatsoever, you got to tell me 1 or 2 things I don't understand, and what nobody don't understand, and what everybody is very anxious to understand. I want to know what you've been doing to my chair upstairs, and I want to know how 'tis your room was empty, and how you got in again. Them as stops in this house comes in by the doors. That's the rule of the house, and that you didn't do, and what I want to know is how you did come in. And I want to know." Suddenly the stranger raised his gloved hands clenched, stamped his foot, and said, "Stop," with such extraordinary violence that he silenced her instantly. "You don't understand," he said, "who I am or what I am." "I'll show you. By heaven, I'll show you then." He put his open palm over his face and withdrew it. The center of his face became a black cavity, he said. He stepped forward and handed Mrs. Hall something which she, staring at his metamorphosed face, accepted automatically. Then, when she saw what it was, she screamed loudly, dropped it, and staggered back. The nose, it was the stranger's nose, pink and shining, rolled on the floor. Then he removed his spectacles, and everyone in the bar gasped. He took off his hat, and with a violent gesture tore at his whiskers and bandages. For a moment, they resisted him. A flash of horrible anticipation passed through the barrow. "My God," said someone. Then off they came. It was worse than anything. Mrs. Hall, standing open-mouthed and horror-struck, shrieked at what she saw, and made for the door of the house. Everyone began to move. They were prepared for scars, disfigurements, tangible horrors, but nothing. The bandages and false hair flew across the passage into the bar, making a hobbledehoy jump to avoid them. Everyone tumbled on everyone else down the steps. For the man who stood there shouting some incoherent explanation was a solid gesticulating figure up to the coat collar of him. And then, nothingness, no visible thing at all. People down the village heard shouts and shrieks, and looking up the street saw the coach and horses violently firing out its humanity. They saw Mrs. Hall fall down, and Mr. Teddy Henfrey jump to avoid tumbling over her, and then they heard the frightful screams of Milly, who, emerging suddenly from the kitchen at the noise of the tumult, had come upon the headless stranger from behind. These increased suddenly. Forthwith, everyone all down the street, the sweet-stuff seller, coconut-shy proprietor and his assistant, the swing-man, little boys and girls, rustic dandies, smart wenches, elders and aproned gypsies, began running towards the inn, and in a miraculously short space of time, a crowd of perhaps 40 people, and rapidly increasing, swayed and hooted and inquired and exclaimed and suggested. In front of Mrs. Hall's establishment, everyone seemed eager to talk at once, and the result was Babel. A small group supported Mrs. Hall, who was picked up in a state of collapse. There was a conference, and the incredible evidence of a vociferous eyewitness. "Oh, Bogey, what's he been doin'? Then ain't hurt the girl, as he run it on with a knife. I believe no Ed, I tell you. I don't mean no manner of speaking. I mean marn out Ed nonsense. 'Tis some conjuring trick fetched off his wrapping. He did." In its struggles to see in through the open door, the crowd formed itself into a straggling wedge, with the more adventurous apex nearest the inn high stood for a moment. I heard the gal scream, and he turned. I saw her skirts whisk, and he went after her. Didn't take 10 seconds. Back he comes with a knife in his hand and a loaf, stood just as if he was staring. Not a moment ago. Went in that there door. I tell he ain't gart no Ed at all. You just missed in. There was a disturbance behind, and the speaker stopped to step aside for a little procession that was marching very resolutely towards the house. First Mr. Hall, very red and determined, then Mr. Bobby Jaffers, the village constable, and then the wary Mr. Wodgers. They had come now armed with a warrant. People shouted conflicting information of the recent circumstances. "There no Ed," said Jaffers. "I got to rest in, and rest in. I will." Mr. Hall marched up the steps, marched straight to the door of the parlor and flung it open. "Constable," he said, "do your duty." Jaffers marched in. Hall next, Wodgers last. They saw in the dim light the headless figure facing them, with a gnawed crust of bread in one gloved hand and a chunk of cheese in the other. "That's him," said Hallwat. "The devil's this," came in a tone of angry expostulation from above the collar of the figure. "You're a damned rum customer, mister," said Mr. Jaffers, "but Ed or no Ed, the warrant says body." "Keep off," said the figure, starting back. Abruptly he whipped down the bread and cheese, and Mr. Hall just grasped the knife on the table. In time to save it. Off came the stranger's left glove and was slapped in Jaffers' face. In another moment, Jaffers, cutting short some statement concerning a warrant, had gripped him by the handless wrist and caught his invisible throat. He got a sounding kick on the shin that made him shout, but he kept his grip. Hall sent the knife sliding along the table to Wodgers, who acted as goalkeeper for the offensive, so to speak, and then stepped forward as Jaffers and the stranger swayed and staggered towards him, clutching and hitting in. A chair stood in the way and went aside with a crash as they came down together. "Get the feet," said Jaffers between his teeth. Mr. Hall, endeavoring to act on instructions, received a sounding kick in the ribs that disposed of him for a moment. And Mr. Wodgers, seeing the decapitated stranger had rolled over and got the upper side of Jaffers, retreated towards the door, knife in hand, and so collided with Mr. Huxter and the Sitterbridge carter coming to the rescue of law and order. At the same moment down came 3 or 4 bottles from the chiffonier and shot a web of pungency into the air. "Of the room will surrender," cried the stranger. So he had Jaffers down, and in another moment he stood up, panting, a strange figure, headless and handless, for he had pulled off his right glove now as well as his left. "It's no good," he said, as if sobbing for breath. It was the strangest thing in the world to hear that voice coming as if out of empty space, but the Sussex peasants are perhaps the most matter-of-fact people under the sun. Jaffers got up also and produced a pair of handcuffs. Then he stared. "I say," said Jaffers, brought up short by a dim realization of the incongruity of the whole business. "Darn it. Can't use 'em." As I can see, the stranger ran his arm down his waistcoat, and as if by a miracle, the buttons to which his empty sleeve pointed became undone. Then he said something about his shin and stooped down. He seemed to be fumbling with his shoes and socks. "Why," said Huxter suddenly, "that's not a man at all. It's just empty clothes. Look, you can see down his collar and the linings of his clothes. I could put my arm." He extended his hand. It seemed to meet something in midair, and he drew it back with a sharp exclamation. "I wish you'd keep your fingers out of my eye," said the aerial voice, in a tone of savage expostulation. "The fact is, I'm all here, head, hands, legs, and all the rest of it. But it happens I'm invisible. It's a confounded nuisance, but am. That's no reason why I should be poked to pieces by every stupid bumpkin in Iping. Is it the suit of clothes, now all unbuttoned and hanging loosely upon its unseen supports, stood up, arms akimbo?" Several other of the menfolks had now entered the room, so that it was closely crowded and visible. Said Huxter, ignoring the stranger's abuse. "Who ever heard the likes of that? It's strange, perhaps, but it's not a crime. Why am I assaulted by a policeman in this fashion?" "Ah, that's a different matter," said Jeffers. "No doubt. You are a bit difficult to see in this light, but I got a warrant and it's all correct. What I'm after ain't no invisibility, it's burglary. There's a house been broke into and money took, well, and circumstances certainly point stuff and nonsense." "Sir," "But I've got my instructions well," said the stranger. "I'll come." "I'll come? But no handcuffs, it's the regular thing," said Jaffers. "No handcuffs," stipulated the stranger. "Pardon me," said Jaffers. Abruptly the figure sat down, and before anyone could realize what was being done, the slippers, socks, and trousers had been kicked off under the table. Then he sprang up again and flung off his coat there. "Stop that," said Jaffers, suddenly realizing what was happening. It struggled, and the shirt slipped out of it and left it limp and empty in his handhold. "Him," said Jaffers. Loudly, "once he gets the things off." "Hold him," cried everyone, and there was a rush at the fluttering white shirt, which was now all that was visible of the stranger. He gripped at the waistcoat. The shirt sleeve planted a shrewd blow in Hall's face that stopped his open-armed advance, sent him backward into old Toothsome the sexton, and in another moment the garment was lifted up and became convulsed and vacantly flapping about the arms. Even as a shirt that is being thrust over a man's head. Jaffers clutched at it and only helped to pull it off. He was struck in the mouth out of the air and incontinently threw his truncheon and smote Teddy Henfrey savagely upon the crown of his head. "Look out," said everybody. "Fencing at random and hitting at nothing. Hold him. Shut the door. Don't let him loose. I got something." Here he is. A perfect babel of noises they made. Everybody, it seemed, was being hit all at once, and Sandy Wadgers, knowing as ever, and his wits sharpened by a frightful blow in the nose, reopened the door and led the rout. The others, following incontinently, were jammed for a moment in the corner by the doorway. The hitting continued. Phipps, the Unitarian, had a front tooth broken, and Henfrey was injured in the cartilage of his ear. Jaffers was struck under the jaw, and turning, caught at something that intervened between him and Huckster in the melee, and prevented their coming together. He felt a muscular chest, and in another moment, the whole mass of struggling, excited men shot out into the crowded alley, got him shouted. Jaffers, choking and reeling through them all, and wrestling with purple face and swelling veins against his unseen enemy. Men staggered right and left as the extraordinary conflict swayed swiftly towards the house door, and went spinning down the half-dozen steps of the inn. Jaffers cried in a strangled voice, holding tight nevertheless, and making play with his knee, spun around and fell heavily undermost with his head on the gravel. Only then did his fingers relax. There were excited cries of "hold him invisible," and so forth, and a young fellow, a stranger in the place whose name did not come to light, rushed in at once, caught something, missed his hold, and fell over the constable's prostrate body. Halfway across the road a woman screamed as something pushed by her. A dog, kicked apparently, yelped and ran howling into Huckster's yard, and with that the transit of the invisible man was accomplished. For a space people stood amazed and gesticulating, and then came panic, and scattered them abroad through the village as a gust scatters dead leaves. But Jaffers lay quite still, face upward and knees bent, at the foot of the steps of the inn. Chapter 8. In Transit. The 8th chapter is exceedingly brief, and relates that Gibbons, the amateur naturalist of the district, while lying out on the spacious open downs without a soul within a couple of miles of him, as he thought, and almost dozing, heard close to him the sound as of a man coughing, sneezing, and then swearing savagely to himself, and looking, beheld nothing. Yet the voice was indisputable, continued to swear with that breadth and variety that distinguishes the swearing of a cultivated man. It grew to a climax, diminished again, and died away in the distance, going as it seemed to him in the direction of Aberdeen. It lifted to a spasmodic sneeze and ended. Gibbons had heard nothing of the morning's occurrences, but the phenomenon was so striking and disturbing that his philosophical tranquility vanished. He got up hastily, and hurried down the steepness of the hill towards the village as fast as he could go. Chapter 9. Mr. Thomas Marvel. You must picture Mr. Thomas Marvel as a person of copious, flexible visage, a nose of cylindrical protrusion, a liquorish, ample, fluctuating mouth, and a beard of bristling eccentricity. His figure inclined to embonpoint. His short limbs accentuated this inclination. He wore a furry silk hat, and the frequent substitution of twine and shoelaces for buttons, apparent at critical points of his costume, marked a man essentially bachelor. Mr. Thomas Marvel was sitting with his feet in a ditch by the roadside over the down towards Aberdeen, about 1.5 miles out of Iping. His feet, save for socks of irregular openwork, were bare. His big toes were broad and pricked like the ears of a watchful dog. In a leisurely manner, he did everything in a leisurely manner. He was contemplating trying on a pair of boots. They were the soundest boots he had come across for a long time, but too large for him, whereas the ones he had were, in dry weather, a very comfortable fit, but too thin-soled for damp. Mr. Thomas Marvel hated roomy shoes, but then he hated damp. He had never properly thought out which he hated most, and it was a pleasant day, and there was nothing better to do. So he put the 4 shoes in a graceful group on the turf and looked at them. And seeing them there among the grass and springing agrimony, it suddenly occurred to him that both pairs were exceedingly ugly to see. He was not at all startled by a voice behind him, "Their boots, anyhow," said the voice. "They are charity boots," said Mr. Thomas Marvel, with his head on one side regarding them distastefully. "And which is the ugliest pair in the whole blessed universe? I'm darned if I know him," said the voice of worn worse. "In fact, I've worn none, but none so audacious ugly, if you'll allow the expression. I've been cadging boots, in particular, for days, because I was sick of them. They're sound enough, of course, but a gentleman on tramp sees such a thundering lot of his boots. And if you'll believe me, I've raised nothing in the whole blessed country. Try as I would, but them. Look at 'em. And a good country for boots, too, in a general way. But it's just my promiscuous luck. I've got my boots in this country 10 years or more. And then they treat you like this. It's a beast of a country," said the voice. "And pigs for people, ain't it?" said Mr. Thomas Marvel. "But them boots. It beats it." He turned his head over his shoulder to the right, to look at the boots of his interlocutor with a view to comparisons, and lo, where the boots of his interlocutor should have been were neither legs nor boots. He was irradiated by the dawn of a great amazement. "Where are you?" said Mr. Thomas Marvel over his shoulder, and coming on all fours. He saw a stretch of empty downs with the wind swaying the remote, green-pointed furze bushes. "I drunk," said Mr. Marvelhave. "I had visions? Was I talking to myself?" "Well, don't be alarmed," said a voice. "None of your ventriloquizing me?" said Mr. Thomas Marvel, rising sharply to his feet. "Where are you?" "Alarmed, indeed. Don't be alarmed," repeated the voice. "We'll be alarmed in a minute, you silly fool," said Mr. Thomas Marvel. "Where are you?" "Let me get my mark on your area buried," said Mr. Thomas Marvel, after an interval. There was no answer. Mr. Thomas Marvel stood bootless and amazed, his jacket nearly thrown off. "Peewit," said a peewit. "Very remote peewit, indeed," said Mr. Thomas Marvel. "This ain't no time for foolery." The down was desolate, east and west. The road with its shallow ditches and white bordering stakes ran smooth and empty north and south. Save for that peewit, the blue sky was empty too, so help me, said Mr. Thomas Marvel, shuffling his coat onto his shoulders against the drink. "North and south. I might ha' known it's not the drink," said the voice. "You keep your nerves steady." "Oh," said Mr. Marvel. And his face grew white amidst its pachesets. The drink his lips repeated, noiselessly. He remained staring about him, rotating slowly backwards. "Could have swore I heard a voice," he whispered of. "Course you did, it's there again," said Mr. Marvel, closing his eyes and clasping his hand on his brow with a tragic gesture. He was suddenly taken by the collar and shaken violently. "And left more days than ever. Don't be a fool," said the voice. "Off, my blooming chump," said Mr. Marvel. "It's no good. It's fretting about them blarsted boots. I'm off my blessed blooming chump. Or it's spirits, neither one thing nor the other," said the voice. "Listen, chump," said Mr. Marvel. "A minute," said the voice, penetratingly, tremulous with self-control. "Well," said Mr. Thomas Marvel, with a strange feeling of having been dug in the chest. "By a finger, y'all think? I'm just imagination." "Just imagination? What else can you be?" said Mr. Thomas Marvel. "Rubbing the back of his neck. Very well," said the voice, in a tone of relief. "Then I'm going to throw flints at you till you think differently. But where are you?" The voice made no answer. Whiz came a flint, apparently out of the air, and missed Mr. Marvel's shoulder by a hair's breadth. Mr. Marvel, turning, saw a flint jerk up into the air, trace a complicated path, hang for a moment, and then fling at his feet with almost invisible rapidity. He was too amazed to dodge. Whiz it came, and ricocheted from a bare toe into the ditch. Mr. Thomas Marvel jumped a foot and howled aloud. Then he started to run, tripped over an unseen obstacle, and came head over heels into a sitting position. "Now," said the voice, as a third stone curved upward and hung in the air above the tramp. "I imagination." Mr. Marvel, by way of reply, struggled to his feet, and was immediately rolled over again. He lay quiet for a moment. "If you struggle any more," said the voice, "I shall throw the flint at your head. It's a fair do," said Mr. Thomas Marvel, sitting up, taking his wounded toe in hand, and fixing his eye on the third missile. "Don't understand it. Stones flinging themselves. Stones talking. Put yourself down. Rot away. I'm done. The third flint fell. It's very simple," said the voice. "An invisible man." "Tell us something I don't know," said Mr. Marvel, gasping with pain. "Where you've hid, how you do it, I don't know. I'm beat, that's all," said the voice. "Invisible. That's what I want you to understand. Anyone could see that. There is no need for you to be so confounded impatient, mister. Now then, give us a notion. How are you hid? I'm invisible. That's the great point. And what I want you to understand is this." "But whereabouts?" interrupted Mr. Marvel. "Hair. 6 yards in front of you. Oh, come. I ain't blind. You'll be telling me next you're just thin air. I'm not one of your ignorant tramps. Yes, I am thin air. You're looking through me. What? Ain't there any stuff to you? Vox it? What is it? Jabber? Is it that I am just a human being? Solid, needing food and drink? Needing covering too. But I'm invisible. You see? Invisible. Simple idea. Invisible what? Real like, yes. Real. Let's have a hand of you," said Marvel. "If you are real. It won't be so darn out of the way like then. Lord," he said, "how you made me jump." Gripping me like that, he felt the hand that had closed round his wrist with his disengaged fingers, and his fingers went timorously up the arm, patted a muscular chest, and explored a bearded face. Marvel's face was astonishment dashed. He said, "If this don't beat cockfighting. Most remarkable. And there I can see a rabbit clean through you, 'arf a mile away. Not a bit of you visible, except—" He scrutinized the apparently empty space keenly. "You haven't been eating bread and cheese?" he asked. "Holding the invisible arm. You're quite right. and it's not quite assimilated into the system. Ah, said Mr. Marvel sort of ghostly. Though, of course, all this isn't half so wonderful as you think. It's quite wonderful enough for my modest wants. Said Mr. Thomas Marvel Hoger manage it. How the deuce is it done? It's too long a story. And besides, I tell you, the whole business fairly beats me. Said Mr. Marvel, what I want to say at present is this. I need help. I have come to that. I came upon you suddenly. I was wandering, mad with rage, naked, impotent. I could have murdered. And I saw you. Lord, said Mr. Marvel, he came up behind you, hesitated, went on. Mr. Marvel's expression was eloquent. Then stopped. Here, I said, is an outcast like myself. This is the man for me. So I turned back and came to you. You. And, Lord, said Mr. Marvel, but I'm all in a tizzy. May I ask, how is it? And what you may be requiring in the way of help? Invisible, I want you to help me get clothes and shelter, and then with other things. I've left them long enough. If you won't, well, but you will. Must look here, said Mr. Marvel, I'm too flabbergasted. Don't knock me about any more, and leave me go. I must get steady a bit, and you've pretty near broken my toe. It's all so unreasonable. Empty downs, empty sky. Nothing visible for miles except the bosom of nature. And then comes a voice out of heaven, and stones, and a fist. Lord, pull yourself together, said the voice, for you have to do the job I've chosen for you. Mr. Marvel blew out his cheeks, and his eyes were round. I've chosen you, said the voice. You are the only man except some of those fools down there who knows there is such a thing as an invisible man. You have to be my helper. Help me, and I will do great things for you. An invisible man is a man of power. He stopped for a moment to sneeze violently. But if you betray me, he said, if you fail to do as I direct you. He paused and tapped Mr. Marvel's shoulder smartly. Mr. Marvel gave a yelp of terror at the touchy. Don't want to betray you, said Mr. Marvel, edging away from the direction of the finger staunt. Don't you go a-thinking that, whatever you do. All I want to do is to help you. Just tell me what I got to do. Lord, whatever you want done, that I'm most willing to do. Chapter 10. Mr. Marvel's visit to Iping. After the first gusty panic had spent itself, Iping became argumentative. Skepticism suddenly reared its head, rather nervous skepticism, not at all assured of its back, but skepticism nevertheless. It is so much easier not to believe in an invisible man, and those who had actually seen him dissolve into air or felt the strength of his arm could be counted on the fingers of 2 hands. And of these witnesses, Mr. Rogers was presently missing, having retired impregnably behind the bolts and bars of his own house. And Jaffers was lying stunned in the parlor of the coach, and Horse's great and strange ideas transcending experience often have less effect upon men and women than smaller, more tangible considerations. Iping was gay with bunting, and everybody was in gala dress. Whit Monday had been looked forward to for a month or more. By the afternoon, even those who believed in the unseen were beginning to resume their little amusements in a tentative fashion, on the supposition that he had quite gone away, and with the skeptics he was already a jest. But people, skeptics and believers alike, were remarkably sociable all that day. Haseman's Meadow was gay with a tent, in which Mrs. Bunting and other ladies were preparing tea, while, without, the Sunday school children ran races and played games under the noisy guidance of the curate and the Misses Cuss and Sackbut. No doubt there was a slight uneasiness in the air, but people for the most part had the sense to conceal whatever imaginative qualms they experienced. On the village green an inclined strong rope, down which, clinging the while to a pulley-swung handle, one could be hurled violently against a sack at the other end, came in for considerable favor among the adolescents, as also did the swings and the coconut shies. There was also promenading, and the steam organ attached to a small roundabout filled the air with a pungent flavor of oil and with equally pungent music. Members of the club who had attended church in the morning were splendid in badges of pink and green, and some of the gayer-minded had also adorned their bowler hats with brilliant-colored favors of ribbon. The old Fletcher, whose conceptions of holiday-making were severe, was visible through the jasmine about his window, or through the open door, whichever way you chose to look, poised delicately on a plank supported on 2 chairs, and whitewashing the ceiling of his front room. About 4 o'clock a stranger entered the village from the direction of the Downs. He was a short, stout person in an extraordinarily shabby top hat, and he appeared to be very much out of breath. His cheeks were alternately limp and tightly puffed. His mottled face was apprehensive, and he moved with a sort of reluctant alacrity. He turned the corner of the church and directed his way to the coach and horses. Among others, old Fletcher remembers seeing him. And indeed the old gentleman was so struck by his peculiar agitation that he inadvertently allowed a quantity of whitewash to run down the brush into the sleeve of his coat while regarding him. This stranger, to the perceptions of the proprietor of the coconut shy, appeared to be talking to himself, and Mr. Huckster remarked the same thing. He stopped at the foot of the coach and horses' steps, and according to Mr. Huckster, appeared to undergo a severe internal struggle before he could induce himself to enter the house. Finally he marched up the steps, and was seen by Mr. Huckster to turn to the left and open the door of the parlor. Mr. Huckster heard voices from within the room and from the bar, apprising the man of his erudite room's private said hall, and the stranger shut the door clumsily and went into the bar. In the course of a few minutes he reappeared, wiping his lips with the back of his hand, with an air of quiet satisfaction that somehow impressed Mr. Huckster as assumed. He stood looking about him for some moments, and then Mr. Huckster saw him walk in an oddly furtive manner towards the gates of the yard, upon which the parlor window opened. The stranger, after some hesitation, leant against one of the gate-posts, produced a short clay pipe, and prepared to fill it. His fingers trembled while doing so. He lit it clumsily, and folding his arms began to smoke in a languid attitude, an attitude which his occasional glances up the yard altogether belied. All this Mr. Huckster saw over the canisters of the tobacco window, and the singularity of the man's behavior prompted him to maintain his observation. Presently the stranger stood up abruptly and put his pipe in his pocket. Then he vanished into the yard. Forthwith Mr. Huckster, conceiving he was witness of some petty larceny, leapt round his counter and ran out into the road to intercept the thief. As he did so, Mr. Marvel reappeared, his hat askew, a big bundle and a blue tablecloth in one hand, and 3 books tied together, as it proved afterwards with the vicar's braces, in the other. Directly he saw Huckster he gave a sort of gasp, and turning sharply to the left, began to run. "Stop, thief!" cried Huckster, and set off after him. Mr. Huckster's sensations were vivid but brief. He saw the man just before him, and spurting briskly for the church corner and the hill road. He saw the village flags and festivities beyond, and a face or so turned towards him. He bawled, "Stop again." He had hardly gone 10 strides before his shin was caught in some mysterious fashion, and he was no longer running, but flying with inconceivable rapidity through the air. He saw the ground suddenly close to his face. The world seemed to splash into a million whirling specks of light, and subsequent proceedings interested him no more. Chapter 11. In the coach and horses. Now, in order clearly to understand what had happened in the inn, it is necessary to go back to the moment when Mr. Marvel first came into view of Mr. Huckster's window. At that precise moment, Mr. Cuss and Mr. Bunting were in the parlor. They were seriously investigating the strange occurrences of the morning, and were, with Mr. Hall's permission, making a thorough examination of the invisible man's belongings. Jaffers had partially recovered from his fall, and had gone home in the charge of his sympathetic friends. The stranger's scattered garments had been removed by Mrs. Hall, and the room tidied up. And on the table under the window, where the stranger had been wont to work, Cuss had hit almost at once on 3 big books in manuscript, labeled Diary, said Cuss. Putting the 3 books on the table now, at any rate, we shall learn something. The vicar stood with his hands on the table. Diary, repeated Cuss. Sitting down, putting 2 volumes to support the 3rd, and opening Itham, no name on the flyleaf. Bother. Cipher. And figures. The vicar came round to look over his shoulder. Cuss turned the pages over with a face suddenly disappointed. Dear me. It's all cipher, Bunting. There are no diagrams, asked Mr. Bunting. No illustrations, throwing light. See for yourself, said Mr. Kusimov. It's mathematical, and some of it's Russian or some such language, to judge by the letters, and some of it's Greek. Now the Greek, I thought you, of course, said Mr. Bunting, taking out and wiping his spectacles, and feeling suddenly very uncomfortable, for he had no Greek left in his mind worth talking about. Yes, the Greek, of course, may furnish a clue. I'll find you a place. I'd rather glance through the volumes first, said Mr. Bunting. Still wiping a general impression first, Cuss, and then, we can go looking for clues. He coughed, put on his glasses, arranged them fastidiously, coughed again, and wished something would happen to avert the seemingly inevitable exposure. Then he took the volume Cuss handed him in a leisurely manner. And then something did happen. The door opened suddenly. Both gentlemen started violently, looked round, and were relieved to see a sporadically rosy face beneath a furry silk hat. Asked the face, and stood staring. No, said both gentlemen at once over the other side. My man, said Mr. Bunting. And please shut that door, said Mr. Cuss. Irritali, all right? Said the intruder, as it seemed in a low voice, curiously different from the huskiness of its first inquiry. Right, you are. I should judge, said Mr. Bunting, amusing fellows. They are. Stand clear. Indeed. A nautical term, referring to his getting back out of the room. I suppose I dare say so, said Cuss. Me nerves are all loose today. It quite made me jump. The door opening like that, Mr. Bunting smiled, as if he had not jumped in now, he said with a sigh. These books. Someone sniffed as he did. Soon thing is indisputable, said Bunting, drawing up a chair next to that of Cuss. There certainly have been very strange things happen in Iping during the last few days. Very strange. I cannot, of course, believe in this absurd invisibility story. It's incredible, said Cuss. Incredible. But the fact remains that I certainly saw right down his sleeve. But did you? Are you sure? Suppose a mirror, for instance. Hallucinations are so easily produced. I don't know if you have ever seen a really good conjurer. I won't argue again, said Cuss. We've thrashed that out, Bunting. And just now there's these books. Here's some of what I take to be Greek. Greek letters, certainly. He pointed to the middle of the page. Mr. Bunting flushed slightly and brought his face nearer, apparently finding some difficulty with his glasses. Suddenly, he became aware of a strange feeling at the nape of his neck. He tried to raise his head and encountered an immovable resistance. The feeling was a curious pressure, the grip of a heavy, firm hand, and it bore his chin irresistibly to the table. Don't move. Little men, whispered a voice, or I'll brain you both. He looked into the face of Cuss, close to his own, and each saw a horrified reflection of his own sickly astonishment. Sorry to handle you so roughly, said the voice. But it's unavoidable. Since when did you learn to pry into an investigator's private memoranda? Said the voice. And two chins struck the table simultaneously, and two sets of teeth rattled. Since when did you learn to invade the private rooms of a man in misfortune? And the concussion was repeated. Where have they put my clothes? Listen, said the voice. The windows are fastened, and I've taken the key out of the door. I am a fairly strong man, and I have the poker handy, besides being invisible. There's not the slightest doubt that I could kill you both, and get away quite easily if I wanted to. Do you understand? Very well. If I let you go, will you promise not to try any nonsense, and do what I tell you? The vicar and the doctor looked at one another. And the doctor pulled a fasces, said Mr. Bunting. And the doctor repeated it. Then the pressure on the necks relaxed, and the doctor and the vicar sat up, both very red in the face, and wriggling their heads. Please keep sitting where you are, said the invisible man. Here's the poker. You see, when I came into this room, continued the invisible man, after presenting the poker to the tip of the nose of each of his visitors, I did not expect to find it occupied, and I expected to find, in addition to my books of memoranda, an outfit of clothing. Where is it? No, don't rise. I can see it's gone. Now, just at present. Though the days are quite warm enough for an invisible man to run about stark, the evenings are quite chilly. I want clothing, and other accommodation, and I must also have those 3 books. Chapter 12. The invisible man loses his temper. It is unavoidable that at this point, the narrative should break off again, for a certain very painful reason that will presently be apparent. While these things were going on in the parlor, and while Mr. Huckster was watching Mr. Marvel smoking his pipe against the gate, not a dozen yards away were Mr. Hall and Teddy Henfrey discussing in a state of cloudy puzzlement the one iping topic. Suddenly, there came a violent thud against the door of the parlor, a sharp cry, and then "Silence, low," said Teddy Henfrey, who'll low from the tap. Mr. Hall took things in slowly. But surely that ain't right, he said, and came round from behind the bar towards the parlor door. He and Teddy approached the door together, with intent faces. Their eyes considered some'at wrong, said Hall, and Henfrey nodded agreement. Whiffs of an unpleasant chemical odor met them, and there was a muffled sound of conversation, very rapid and subdued. "You all right?" there asked Hall, rapping. The muttered conversation ceased abruptly. For a moment silence. Then the conversation was resumed, in hissing whispers. Then a sharp cry of "No, no, you don't." There came a sudden motion, and the oversetting of a chair, a brief struggle. Silence again. "What the deuce!" exclaimed Henfrey. "Ollie, right there?" asked Mr. Hall, sharply. Again, the vicar's voice answered with a curious jerking intonation. "Quite right. Please don't interrupt, Odd," said Mr. Henfrey. "Odd," said Mr. Hall. "Says, don't interrupt," said Henfrey. "Hearden," said Halland, a sniff. Said Henfrey. They remained listening. Conversation was rapid and subdued. "He can't," said Mr. Bunting, his voice rising. "I tell you, sir, I will not." "What was that?" asked Henfrey. "Says he winnart," said Hall Warren, speaking to us. "Was he disgraceful?" said Mr. Bunting. "Within disgraceful," said Mr. Henfrey. "Heard it?" "Distinct." "Who's that speaking now?" asked Henframer. "Us, I suppose," said Hall. "Can you hear anything?" Silence. The sounds within, indistinct and perplexing sounds like throwing the tablecloth about, said Hall. Mrs. Hall appeared behind the bar. Hall made gestures of silence and invitation. This aroused Mrs. Hall's wifely opposition. "What you're listening there for, Hall?" she asked. "Ain't you nothing better to do?" "Busy day like this," Hall tried to convey everything by grimaces and dumb show. But Mrs. Hall was obdurate. She raised her voice. So Hall and Henfrey, rather crestfallen, tiptoed back to the bar, gesticulating to explain to her. At first she refused to see anything in what they had heard at all. Then she insisted on Hall keeping silence while Henfrey told her his story. She was inclined to think the whole business nonsense. Perhaps they were just moving the furniture about, he heard and say, disgraceful. "That I did," said Hallie. "Heard that, Mrs. Hall?" said Henfrey like as not. "Began Mrs. Hall," said Mr. Teddy Henfrey. "I hear the window." "What window?" asked Mrs. Hall. "Parlor window," said Henfrey. Everyone stood listening intently. Mrs. Hall's eyes, directed straight before her, saw without seeing the brilliant oblong of the inn door, the road white and vivid, and Huckster's shop front blistering in the June sun. Abruptly Huckster's door opened and Huckster appeared, eyes staring with excitement, arms gesticulating. "Jap!" cried Huckster. "Stop, thief!" and he ran obliquely across the oblong towards the yard gates and vanished. Simultaneously came a tumult from the parlor, and a sound of windows being closed. Hall, Henfrey, and the human contents of the tap rushed out at once pell-mell into the street. They saw someone whisk round the corner towards the road, and Mr. Huckster executing a complicated leap in the air that ended on his face and shoulder. Down the street people were standing astonished or running towards them. Mr. Huckster was stunned. Henfrey stopped to discover this, but Hall and the two laborers from the tap rushed at once to the corner, shouting incoherent things, and saw Mr. Marvel vanishing by the corner of the church wall. They appear to have jumped to the impossible conclusion that this was the invisible man, suddenly become visible, and set off at once along the lane in pursuit. But Hall had hardly run a dozen yards before he gave a loud shout of astonishment, and went flying headlong sideways, clutching one of the laborers and bringing him to the ground. He had been charged just as one charges a man at football. The second laborer came round in a circle, stared, and conceiving that Hall had tumbled over of his own accord, turned to resume the pursuit, only to be tripped by the ankle just as Huckster had been. Then, as the first laborer struggled to his feet, he was kicked sideways by a blow that might have felled an ox. As he went down, the rush from the direction of the village green came round the corner. First to appear was the proprietor of the Coconut Shy, a burly man in a blue jersey. He was astonished to see the lane empty save for 3 men sprawling absurdly on the ground. And then something happened to his rearmost foot, and he went headlong and rolled sideways just in time to graze the feet of his brother and partner, following headlong. The two were then kicked, knelt on, fallen over, and cursed by quite a number of overhasty people. Now when Hall and Henfrey and the laborers ran out of the house, Mrs. Hall, who had been disciplined by years of experience, remained in the bar next the till, and suddenly the parlor door was opened, and Mr. Cuss appeared. And without glancing at her, rushed at once down the steps toward the corner. "Hold him," he cried. "Don't let him drop that parcel." He knew nothing of the existence of Marvel. The invisible man had handed over the books and bundle in the yard. The face of Mr. Cuss was angry and resolute, but his costume was defective. A sort of limp white kilt that could only have passed muster and grease. "Hold him," he bawled. "He's got my trousers and every stitch of the vicar's clothes. Tend to him in a minute," he cried to Henfrey as he passed the prostrate Huckster, and coming round the corner to join the tumult, was promptly knocked off his feet into an indecorous sprawl. Somebody in full flight trod heavily on his finger. He yelled, struggled to regain his feet, was knocked against, and thrown on all fours again, and became aware that he was involved not in a capture, but a rout. Everyone was running back to the village. He rose again and was hit severely behind the ear. He staggered and set off back to the coach and horses forthwith, leaping over the deserted huckster who was now sitting up on his way. Behind him, as he was halfway up the inn steps, he heard a sudden yell of rage, rising sharply out of the confusion of cries, and a sounding smack in someone's face. He recognized the voice as that of the Invisible Man, and the note was that of a man suddenly infuriated by a painful blow. In another moment, Mr. Cuss was back in the parlor. "He's coming back. Bunting," he said, rushing in. "Save yourself." Mr. Bunting was standing in the window, engaged in an attempt to clothe himself in the hearth rug and a West Surrey Gazette. "Who's coming?" he said, so startled that his costume narrowly escaped disintegration. "Invisible Man," said Cuss, and rushed onto the window. "We'd better clear out from here. He's fighting mad." Mad. In another moment he was out in the yard. Good heavens! Hesitating between two horrible alternatives, he heard a frightful struggle in the passage of the inn, and his decision was made. He clambered out of the window, adjusted his costume hastily, and fled up the village as fast as his fat little legs would carry him. From the moment when the Invisible Man screamed with rage and Mr. Bunting made his memorable flight up the village, it became impossible to give a consecutive account of affairs in Iping. Possibly the Invisible Man's original intention was simply to cover Marvel's retreat with the clothes and books. But his temper, at no time very good, seems to have gone completely at some chance blow, and forthwith he set to smiting and overthrowing for the mere satisfaction of hurting. You must figure the street full of running figures, of doors slamming, and fights for hiding places. You must figure the tumult suddenly striking on the unstable equilibrium of old Fletcher's planks and 2 chairs, with cataclysmic results. You must figure an appalled couple caught dismally in a swing. And then the whole tumultuous rush has passed, and the Iping street with its gods and flags is deserted, save for the still raging unseen, and littered with coconuts, overthrown canvas screens, and the scattered stock in trade of a sweetstuff stall. Everywhere there is a sound of closing shutters and shoving bolts, and the only visible humanity is an occasional flitting eye under a raised eyebrow in the corner of a window pane. The Invisible Man amused himself for a little while by breaking all the windows in the coach and horses, and then he thrust a street lamp through the parlor window of Mrs. Gribble. He, it must have been, who cut the telegraph wire to Aberdeen just beyond Higgins' cottage on the Aberdeen road. And after that, as his peculiar qualities allowed, he passed out of human perceptions altogether, and he was neither heard, seen, nor felt in Iping any more. He vanished absolutely. But it was the best part of 2 hours before any human being ventured out again into the desolation of Iping Street. Chapter 13. Mr. Marvel discusses his resignation. When the dusk was gathering and Iping was just beginning to peep timorously forth again upon the shattered wreckage of its bank holiday, a short, thick-set man in a shabby silk hat was marching painfully through the twilight behind the beechwoods on the road to Bramblehurst. He carried 3 books bound together by some sort of ornamental elastic ligature and a bundle wrapped in a blue tablecloth. His rubicund face expressed consternation and fatigue. He appeared to be in a spasmodic sort of hurry. He was accompanied by a voice other than his own, and ever and again he winced under the touch of unseen handsif. "You give me the slip again," said the voice. "If you attempt to give me the slip again, Lord," said Mr. Marvel, "that shoulders a mass of bruises as it is, on my honor," said the voice. "I will kill you. I didn't try to give you the slip," said Marvel, in a voice that was not far remote from Tiercy. "Swear I didn't. I didn't know the blessed turning, that was all. How the devil was I to know the blessed turning? As it is, I've been knocked about. You'll get knocked about a great deal more if you don't mind, said the voice, and Mr. Marvel abruptly became silent. He blew out his cheeks, and his eyes were eloquent of despair. It's bad enough to let these floundering yokels explode my little secret without your cutting off with my books. It's lucky for some of them they cut and ran when they did. Here am I. No one knew I was invisible. And now what am I to do? What am I to do? Asked Marvel. So do us seats all about. It will be in the papers. Everybody will be looking for me. Everyone on their guard. The voice broke off into vivid curses and ceased. The despair of Mr. Marvel's face deepened, and his pace slackened. Go on, said the voice. Mr. Marvel's face assumed a grayish tint between the ruddier patches. Don't drop those books, stupid, said the voice. Sharply, overtaking him. The fact is, said the voice, I shall have to make use of you. You're a poor tool. But I must. I'm a miserable tool, said Marvel. You are, said the voice. I'm the worst possible tool you could have, said Marvel. I'm not strong, he said after a discouraging silentium. Not over strong, he repeated. No, and my heart's weak. That little business, I pulled it through, of course. But bless you, I could have dropped. Well, I haven't the nerve and strength for the sort of thing you want. I'll stimulate you. I wish you wouldn't. I wouldn't like to mess up your plans, you know. But I might. Out of sheer funk and misery, you'd better not, said the voice, with quiet emphasis. Wish I was dead, said Marvel. It ain't justice, he said. You must admit, it seems to me, I've a perfect right. Get on, said the voice. Mr. Marvel mended his pace, and for a time they went in silence. Agonit's devilish hard, said Mr. Marvel. This was quite ineffectual. He tried another tack. What do I make by it? He began again in a tone of unendurable wrongo. Shut up, said the voice, with sudden amazing. Big girl, see to you, all right? You do what you're told. You'll do it all right. You're a fool and all that, but you'll do. I tell you, sir, I'm not the man for it. Respectfully, but it is so. If you don't shut up, I shall twist your wrist again, said the invisible money. Want to think presently 2 oblongs of yellow light appeared through the trees, and the square tower of a church loomed through the gloaming. I shall keep my hand on your shoulder, said the voice. All through the village. Go straight through and try no foolery. It will be the worse for you if you do, I know that, sighed Mr. Marvel. I know all that. The unhappy-looking figure in the obsolete silk hat passed up the street of the little village with his burdens, and vanished into the gathering darkness beyond the lights of the windows. Chapter 14. At Port Stowe. 10 o'clock the next morning found Mr. Marvel, unshaven, dirty, and travel-stained, sitting with the books beside him and his hands deep in his pocket, looking very weary, nervous, and uncomfortable, and inflating his cheeks at infrequent intervals, on the bench outside a little inn on the outskirts of Port Stowe. Beside him were the books, but now they were tied with string. The bundle had been abandoned in the pine woods beyond Bramblehurst, in accordance with a change in the plans of the Invisible Man. Mr. Marvel sat on the bench, and although no one took the slightest notice of him, his agitation remained at fever heat. His hands would go ever and again to his various pockets, with a curious, nervous fumbling. When he had been sitting for the best part of an hour, however, an elderly mariner, carrying a newspaper, came out of the inn and sat down beside him. Pleasant day, said the mariner. Mr. Marvel glanced about him with something very like terrorivery. He said, just seasonable weather for the time of year, said the mariner, taking no denial. Quite, said Mr. Marvel. The mariner produced a toothpick and, saving his regard, was engrossed thereby for some minutes. His eyes meanwhile were at liberty to examine Mr. Marvel's dusty figure, and the books beside him. As he had approached Mr. Marvel, he had heard a sound like the dropping of coins into a pocket. He was struck by the contrast of Mr. Marvel's appearance with this suggestion of opulence. Thence his mind wandered back again to a topic that had taken a curiously firm hold of his imagination books. He said suddenly, noisily finishing with the toothpick. Mr. Marvel started and looked at Themo. "Yes," he says, "they're books. There's some extraordinary things in books?" Said the Marinere. "Believe you," said Mr. Marvel, "and some extraordinary things out of 'em." Said the Mariner. "True likewise," said Mr. Marvel. He eyed his interlocutor and then glanced about him. "There's some extraordinary things in newspapers." "For example?" said the Mariner. "There are in this newspaper," said the Mariner. Said Mr. Marvel. "There's a story," said the Mariner, fixing Mr. Marvel with an eye that was firm and deliberate. "There's a story about an invisible man, for instance." Mr. Marvel pulled his mouth askew and scratched his cheek and felt his ears glowing. "What will they be writing next?" he asked faintly. "Austria or America?" "Neither," said the Mariner. "Here." "Lord," said Mr. Marvel. "Starting when I say here," said the Mariner. To Mr. Marvel's intense relief, "I don't, of course, mean here in this place. I mean hereabouts an invisible man." Said Mr. Marvel. "And what's he been up to?" "Everything," said the Mariner, controlling Marvel with his eye and then amplifying. "Every blessed thing. I ain't seen a paper these 4 days." Said Marvel. "Iping's the place he started at," said the Mariner. "Indeed," said Mr. Marvel. "He started there. And where he came from, nobody don't seem to know. Here it is, peculiar story from Iping. And it says in this paper that the evidence is extraordinary strong." "Extraordinary, Lord," said Mr. Marvel. "But then, it's an extraordinary story. There's a clergyman and a medical gent witnesses, saw 'em all right and proper, or leastways didn't see 'em. He was staying, it says, at the Coach and Horses, and no one don't seem to have been aware of his misfortune, it says, aware of his misfortune, until in an altercation in the inn, it says, his bandages on his head was torn off. It was then observed that his head was invisible. Attempts were at once made to secure him, but casting off his garments, it says, he succeeded in escaping, but not until after a desperate struggle, in which he had inflicted serious injuries, it says, on our worthy and able constable, Mr. J. Daffers. Pretty straight story, eh?" "Names and everything, Lord," said Mr. Marvel, looking nervously about him, trying to count the money in his pockets by his unaided sense of touch, and full of a strange and novel idea. "It sounds most astonishing, don't it? Extraordinary, I call it. Never heard tell of invisible men before, I haven't. But nowadays one hears such a lot of extraordinary things. That all he did?" asked Marvel, trying to seem at his ease. "It's enough, ain't it?" said the Mariner. "Didn't go back by any chance?" asked Marvel. "Just escaped, and that's all." All," said the Mariner. "Why, ain't it enough, quite enough?" said Marvel. "I should think it was enough," said the Mariner. "I should think it was enough. He didn't have any pals." "It don't say he had any pals." "Does it?" asked Mr. Marvel, anxious. "Ain't one of a sort enough for you?" asked the Mariner. "No, thank heaven, as one might say. He didn't." He nodded his head slowly. "It makes me regular uncomfortable. The bear thought of that chap running about the country. He is at present at large, and from certain evidence it is supposed that he has took, I suppose they mean, the road to Port Stowe. You see, we're right in it. None of your American wonders this time. And just think of the things he might do. Where'd you be if he took a drop over and above, and had a fancy to go for you?" Suppose he wants to rob. Who can prevent him? He can trespass, he can burgle, he could walk through a cordon of policemen as easy as me, or you could give the slip to a blind man. Easier. For these here blind chaps here uncommon sharp, I'm told. And wherever there was liquor, he fancied. He's got a tremendous advantage, certainly, said Mr. Marveland. Well, you're right, said the mariner, as all this time Mr. Marvel had been glancing about him intently, listening for faint footfalls, trying to detect imperceptible movements. He seemed on the point of some great resolution. He coughed behind his hand. He looked about him again, listened, bent towards the mariner, and lowered his voice. The fact of it is, I happen to know just a thing or two about this invisible man. From private sources, oh, said the mariner. Interested you, yes, said Mr. Marvel, indeed, said the mariner, and may I ask, you'll be astonished, said Mr. Marvel behind his hand. It's tremendous indeed, said the mariner. Fact is, began Mr. Marvel eagerly in a confidential undertone. Suddenly his expression changed marvelously, he said. He rose stiffly in his seat. His face was eloquent of physical suffering. Wow, he said. What's up, said the mariner. Concerned toothache, said Mr. Marvel, and put his hand to his ear. He caught hold of his books. He must be getting on, I think, he said. He edged in a curious way along the seat, away from his interlocutor. But you was just a-going to tell me about this here invisible man, protested the mariner. Mr. Marvel seemed to consult with himself. Hoax, said a voice. It's a hoax, said Mr. Marvel. But it's in the paper, said the mariner. Hoax all the same, said Marvelly. No, the chap that started the lie. There ain't no invisible man whatsoever. Blimey, but how about this paper? You mean to say, not a word of it, said Marvel stoutly. The mariner stared, paper in hand. Mr. Marvel jerkily faced about. Wait a bit, said the mariner, rising and speaking slowly. Do you mean to say, I do, said Mr. Marvel then. Why did you let me go on and tell you all this blarsted stuff then? What do you mean by letting a man make a fool of himself like that for? Mr. Marvel blew out his cheeks. The mariner was suddenly very red indeed. He clenched his hands. I been talking here this 10 minutes, he said. And you little pot-bellied, leathery-faced son of an old boot, couldn't have the elementary manners? Don't you come bandying words with me, said Mr. Marvel. Bandying words. I'm a jolly good mind. Come up, said a voice, and Mr. Marvel was suddenly whirled about and started marching off in a curious spasmodic manner. You'd better move on, said the mariner. Who's moving on, said Mr. Marvel. He was receding obliquely with a curious hurrying gait, with occasional violent jerks forward. Some way along the road he began a muttered monologue, protests, and recrimination. Silly devil, said the mariner. Legs wide apart, elbows akimbo. Watching the receding figure, I'll show you, you silly ass, hoaxing me. It's here, on the paper, Mr. Marvel retorted incoherently, and receding was hidden by a bend in the road. But the mariner still stood magnificent in the midst of the way, until the approach of a butcher's cart dislodged him. Then he turned himself towards Port Stowful of extraordinary asses. He said softly to himself, just to take me down a bit. That was his silly game? It's on the paper. And there was another extraordinary thing he was presently to hear that had happened quite close to him. And that was a vision of a fistful of money, no less, traveling without visible agency along by the wall at the corner of St. Michael's Lane. A brother mariner had seen this wonderful sight that very morning. He had snatched at the money forthwith and had been knocked headlong, and when he had got to his feet, the butterfly money had vanished. Our mariner was in the mood to believe anything, he declared, but that was a bit too stiff. Afterwards, however, he began to think things over. The story of the flying money was true, and all about that neighborhood, even from the August London and Country Banking Company, from the tills of shops and inns, doors standing that sunny weather entirely undexterously, making off that day in handfuls and rouleaux, floating quietly along by walls and shady places, dodging quickly from the approaching eyes of men. And it had, though no man had traced it, invariably ended its mysterious flight in the pocket of that agitated gentleman in the obsolete silk hat, sitting outside the little inn on the outskirts of Port Stowe. It was 10 days after, and indeed only when the Burdock story was already old, that the mariner collated these facts and began to understand how near he had been to the wonderful invisible man. Chapter 15. The Man Who Was Running. In the early evening time, Dr. Kemp was sitting in his study in the Belvedere on the hill overlooking Burdock. It was a pleasant little room with 3 windows, north, west, and south, and bookshelves covered with books and scientific publications, and a broad writing table, and under the north window, a microscope, glass slips, minute instruments, some cultures, and scattered bottles of reagents. Dr. Kemp's solar lamp was lit, albeit the sky was still bright with the sunset light, and his blinds were up because there was no offense of peering outsiders to require them pulled down. Dr. Kemp was a tall and slender young man, with flaxen hair and a mustache almost white, and the work he was upon would earn him, he hoped, the fellowship of the Royal Society. So highly did he think of it. And his eye, presently wandering from his work, caught the sunset blazing at the back of the hill that is over against his own. For a minute perhaps he sat, pen in mouth, admiring the rich golden color above the crest, and then his attention was attracted by the little figure of a man, inky black, running over the hill brow towards him. He was a shortish little man, and he wore a high hat, and he was running so fast that his legs verily twinkled. Another of those fools, said Dr. Kemp-like, that ass who ran into me this morning round a corner. Is the visible man a-coming, sir? I can't imagine what possesses people. One might think we were in the 13th century. He got up, went to the window, and stared at the dusky hillside. And the dark little figure tearing down hither seems in a confounded hurry, said Dr. Kemp. But he doesn't seem to be getting on. If his pockets were full of lead, he couldn't run heavier spurted, sir, said Dr. Kemp. In another moment, the higher of the villas that had clambered up the hill from Burdock had occulted the running figure. He was visible again for a moment, and again, and then again. Three times between the 3 detached houses that came next. And then the terrace hid him asses, said Dr. Kemp, swinging round on his heel and walking back to his writing table. Those who saw the fugitive nearer and perceived the abject terror on his perspiring face, being themselves in the open roadway, did not share in the doctor's contempt. But the man pounded, and as he ran, he chinked like a well-filled purse that is tossed to and fro. He looked neither to the right nor the left, but his dilated eyes stared straight downhill to where the lamps were being lit, and the people were crowded in the street. And his ill-shaped mouth fell apart, and a glary foam lay on his lips, and his breath came hoarse and noisy. All he passed stopped, and began staring up the road and down, and interrogating one another with an inkling of discomfort for the reason of his haste. And then presently, far up the hill, a dog playing in the road yelped and ran under a gate, and as they still wondered something, a wind, a pad, 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 a sound like a panting breathing, rushed by. People screamed. People sprang off the pavement. It passed in shouts. It passed by instinct down the hill. They were shouting in the street before Marvel was halfway there. They were bolting into houses and slamming the doors behind them with the news. He heard it and made one last desperate spurt. Fear came striding by, rushed ahead of him, and in a moment had seized the town. The Invisible Man is coming. The Invisible Man. Chapter 16. The Jolly Cricketers. The Jolly Cricketers is just at the bottom of the hill, where the tram lines begin. The barman leant his fat red arms on the counter and talked of horses with an anemic cabman, while a black-bearded man in gray snapped up biscuit and cheese, drank Burton, and conversed in American with a policeman off-duty. "What's the shouting about?" said the anemic cabman, going off at a tangent, trying to see up the hill over the dirty yellow blind in the low window of the inn. "Somebody ran by outside a fire, perhaps," said the barman. Footsteps approached, running heavily. The door was pushed open violently, and Marvel, weeping and disheveled, his hat gone, the neck of his coat torn open, rushed in, made a convulsive turn, and attempted to shut the door. It was held half open by a strap. "Coming," he bawled, his voice shrieking with terror. "He's coming. The Visible Man. After me. For God's sake. Help. Help." "Help shut the door," said the policeman. "Who's coming?" "What's the row?" He went to the door, released the strap, and it slammed. The American closed the other door. "Let him go inside," said Marvel, staggering and weeping, but still clutching the book. "Let him go inside? Lock me in somewhere. I tell you, he's after me. I give him the slip. He said he'd kill me, and he will." "You're safe," said the man with the black beard. "The door's shut." "What's it all about?" "Let me go inside," said Marvel, and shrieked aloud as a blow suddenly made the fastened door shiver, and was followed by a hurried rapping and a shouting outside. "Hullo," cried the policeman. "Who's there?" Mr. Marvel began to make frantic dives at panels that looked like doors. "She'll kill me. He's got a knife or something. For God's sake, here you are," said the barman. "Come in here." And he held up the flap of the bar. Mr. Marvel rushed behind the bar as the summons outside was repeated. "Didn't open the door." He screamed. "Please don't open the door." "Where shall I hide this invisible man?" then asked the man with the black beard, with one hand behind him. "Guess it's about time we saw him." The window of the inn was suddenly smashed in, and there was a screaming and running to and fro in the street. The policeman had been standing on the settee, staring out, craning to see who was at the door. He got down with raised eyebrows. "It's that," he said. The barman stood in front of the bar parlor door, which was now locked on Mr. Marvel, stared at the smashed window, and came round to the two other men. "Everything was suddenly quiety. Wish I had my truncheon," said the policeman, going irresolutely to the door. "Once we open, in he comes. There's no stopping him. Don't you be in too much hurry about that door," said the anemic cabman. "Anxiously draw the bolts," said the man with the black beard. "And if he comes," he showed a revolver in his hand. "That won't do," said the policeman. "That's murder. I know what country I'm in," said the man with the beard. "I'm going to let off at his legs." "Draw the bolts, not with that blinking thing going off behind me," said the barman, craning over the blindery. "Well," said the man with the black beard, and stooping down, revolver ready, drew them himself. "Barman, cabman, and policeman faced to come in," said the bearded man in an undertone, standing back and facing the unbolted doors with his pistol behind him. No one came in. The door remained closed. 5 minutes afterwards, when a second cabman pushed his head in cautiously, they were still waiting, and an anxious face peered out of the bar parlor and supplied information ere all the doors of the house shut. Asked Marvel. "He's going round, prowling round. He's as artful as the devil, good Lord," said the burly barman. "There's the back. Just watch them doors. I say, He looked about him helplessly. The bar parlor door slammed, and they heard the key turn. There's the yard door and the private door. The yard door. He rushed out of the bar. In a minute, he reappeared with a carving knife in his hand. The yard door was open, he said. And his fat underlip dropped. He may be in the house. Now, said the first cabman. He's not in the kitchen, said the barman. There's 2 women there. And I've stabbed every inch of it with this little beef slicer. And they don't think he's come in. They haven't noticed. Have you fastened it? Asked the first cabman. Out of frocks, said the barman. The man with the beard replaced his revolver. And even as he did so, the flap of the bar was shut down, and the bolt clicked. And then, with a tremendous thud, the catch of the door snapped, and the bar parlor door burst open. They heard Marvel squeal like a caught leveret, and forthwith they were clambering over the bar to his rescue. The bearded man's revolver cracked, and the looking-glass at the back of the parlor starred and came smashing and tinkling down. As the barman entered the room, he saw Marvel, curiously crumpled up and struggling against the door that led to the yard and kitchen. The door flew open while the barman hesitated, and Marvel was dragged into the kitchen. There was a scream and a clatter of pans. Marvel, head down and lugging back obstinately, was forced to the kitchen door, and the bolts were drawn. Then the policeman, who had been trying to pass the barman, rushed in, followed by one of the cabmen, gripped the wrist of the invisible hand that collared Marvel, was hit in the face, and went reeling back. The door opened, and Marvel made a frantic effort to obtain a lodgment behind it. Then the cabman collared. Something got him, said the cabman. The barman's red hands came clawing at the unseen. Here he is, said the barman. Mr. Marvel, released, suddenly dropped to the ground and made an attempt to crawl behind the legs of the fighting men. The struggle blundered round the edge of the door. The voice of the invisible man was heard for the first time, yelling out sharply as the policeman trod on his foot. And he cried out passionately, and his fists flew round like flails. The cabman suddenly whooped and doubled up, kicked under the diaphragm. The door into the bar parlor from the kitchen slammed and covered Mr. Marvel's retreat. The men in the kitchen found themselves clutching at and struggling with empty air. Where's he gone? Cried the man with the beard. Out this way, said the policeman, stepping into the yard and stopping. A piece of tile whizzed by his head and smashed among the crockery on the kitchen table. I'll show him, shouted the man with the black beard. And suddenly a steel barrel shone over the policeman's shoulder, and 5 bullets had followed one another into the twilight whence the missile had come. As he fired, the man with the beard moved his hand in a horizontal curve, so that his shots radiated out into the narrow yard like spokes from a wheel. A silence followed. 5 cartridges, said the man with the black beard. That's the best of all. 4 aces and a joker. Get a lantern, someone, and come and feel about for his body. Chapter 17. Dr. Kemp's Visitor. Dr. Kemp had continued writing in his study until the shots aroused him. Crack, crack, crack. They came one after the other. Hello, said Dr. Kemp, putting his pen into his mouth again and listening. Who's letting off revolvers in Berta? What are the asses at now? He went to the south window, threw it up, and leaning out stared down on the network of windows. Beaded gas lamps and shops, with its black interstices of roof and yard that made up the town at night. Looks like a crowd down the hill, he said. By the cricketers, and remained watching. Thence his eyes wandered over the town to far away where the ship's lights shone, and the pier glowed, a little illuminated, faceted pavilion like a gem of yellow light. The moon in its first quarter hung over the westward hill, and the stars were clear and almost tropically bright. After 5 minutes, during which his mind had traveled into a remote speculation of social conditions of the future, and lost itself at last over the time dimension, Dr. Kemp roused himself with a sigh, pulled down the window again, and returned to his writing desk. It must have been about an hour after this that the front door bell rang. He had been writing slackly and with intervals of abstraction since the shots. He sat listening. He heard the servant answer the door, and waited for her feet on the staircase. "But she did not come wonder what that was," said Dr. Kemp. He tried to resume his work, failed, got up, went downstairs from his study to the landing, rang and called over the balustrade to the housemaid. As she appeared in the hall below was that a letter, he asked only. "A runaway ring, sir." She answered. "I'm restless tonight," he said to himself. He went back to his study, and this time attacked his work resolutely. In a little while he was hard at work again, and the only sounds in the room were the ticking of the clock and the subdued shrillness of his quill, hurrying in the very center of the circle of light his lampshade threw on his table. It was 2 o'clock before Dr. Kemp had finished his work for the night. He rose, yawned, and went downstairs to bed. He had already removed his coat and vest when he noticed that he was thirsty. He took a candle and went down to the dining room in search of a siphon and whiskey. Dr. Kemp's scientific pursuits have made him a very observant man, and as he recrossed the hall, he noticed a dark spot on the linoleum near the mat at the foot of the stairs. He went on upstairs, and then it suddenly occurred to him to ask himself what the spot on the linoleum might be. Apparently, some subconscious element was at work. At any rate, he turned with his burden, went back to the hall, put down the siphon and whiskey, and bending down, touched the spot. Without any great surprise, he found it had the stickiness and color of drying blood. He took up his burden again and returned upstairs, looking about him and trying to account for the blood spot. On the landing he saw something and stopped astonished. The door handle of his own room was blood-stained. He looked at his own hand. It was quite clean, and then he remembered that the door of his room had been open when he came down from his study, and that consequently he had not touched the handle at all. He went straight into his room, his face quite calm, perhaps a trifle more resolute than usual. His glance, wandering inquisitively, fell on the bed. On the counterpane was a mess of blood, and the sheet had been torn. He had not noticed this before because he had walked straight to the dressing table. On the further side, the bedclothes were depressed as if someone had been recently sitting there. And he had an odd impression that he had heard a low voice say, "Good, good, Kemp." But Dr. Kemp was no believer in voices. He stood staring at the tumbled sheets. Was that really a voice? He looked about again, but noticed nothing further than the disordered and blood-stained bed. Then he distinctly heard a movement across the room, near the wash-hand stand. All men, however highly educated, retain some superstitious inklings. The feeling that is called eerie came upon him. He closed the door of the room, came forward to the dressing table, and put down his burdens. Suddenly, with a start, he perceived a coiled and blood-stained bandage of linen rag hanging in mid-air between him and the wash-hand stand. He stared at this in amazement. It was an empty bandage, a bandage properly tied but quite empty. He would have advanced to grasp it, but a touch arrested him, and a voice speaking quite close to him, Kemp, with his mouth open, "Keep your nerve," said the voice chime. An invisible man. Kemp made no answer for a space. Simply stared at the bandage. "Invisible man," he said. "I am an invisible man," repeated the voice. The story he had been active to ridicule only that morning rushed through Kemp's brain. He does not appear to have been either very much frightened or very greatly surprised at the moment. Realization came. Lettieri thought it was all a lie, he said. The uppermost in his mind was the reiterated arguments of the morning have. "You a bandage on he, Ascides," said the invisible Mano, said Kemp, and then roused himself. Say, he said, "but this is nonsense. It's some trick." He stepped forward suddenly, and his hand extended towards the bandage met invisible fingers. He recoiled at the touch and his color changed. "Keep steady, Kemp, for God's sake. I want help badly." Stopped the hand, gripped his arm. He struck at it. "Kemp, cried the voice Kemp. Keep steady, and the grip tightened. A frantic desire to free himself took possession of Kemp. The hand of the bandaged arm gripped his shoulder, and he was suddenly tripped and flung backwards upon the bed. He opened his mouth to shout, and the corner of the sheet was thrust between his teeth. The invisible man had him down grimly, but his arms were free, and he struck and tried to kick savage Lillis into reason. "Will you?" said the invisible man, sticking to him in spite of a pounding in the ribs, be heaven. "You'll madden me in a minute. Still, you fool," bawled the invisible man in Kemp's ear. Kemp struggled for another moment, and then lay still. "If you shout, I'll smash your face," said the invisible man, relieving his mouth. "I'm an invisible man. It's no foolishness and no magic. I really am an invisible man. I want your help. I don't want to hurt you, but if you behave like a frantic rustic, I must. Don't you remember me, Kemp? Griffin, of University College." "Let me get up," said Kemp. "I'll stop where I am. And let me sit quiet for a minute." He sat up and felt his neck. "I am Griffin, of University College, and I have made myself invisible. I am just an ordinary man, a man you have known." "Made invisible, Griffin," said Kemp. "Griffin," answered the voice. "A younger student than you were, almost an albino. 6 feet high and broad, with a pink and white face and red eyes. Who won the medal for chemistry? I am confused," said Kemp. "My brain is rioting. What has this to do with Griffin?" "I am Griffin." Kemp thought. "It's horrible," he said. "But what devilry must happen to make a man invisible?" "It's no devilry. It's a process, sane and intelligible enough." "It's horrible," said Kemp. "Vow on earth. It's horrible enough. But I'm wounded, and in pain, and tired. Great God. Kemp, you are a man. Take it steady. Give me some food and drink, and let me sit down here." Kemp stared at the bandage as it moved across the room, then saw a basket chair dragged across the floor and come to rest near the bed. It creaked, and the seat was depressed the 1/4 of an inch or so. He rubbed his eyes and felt his neck. "Again, this beats ghosts," he said, and laughed stupidly. "That's better. Thank heaven you're getting sensible or silly," said Kemp, and knuckled his eyes. "Give me some whiskey. I'm near dead. It didn't feel so. Where are you? If I get up, shall I run into you? There. All right. Whiskey? Here. Where shall I give it to you?" The chair creaked, and Kemp felt the glass drawn away from him. He let go by an effort. His instinct was all against it. It came to rest poised 20 inches above the front edge of the seat of the chair. He stared at it in infinite perplexity. This must be hypnotism. "You have suggested you are invisible." "Nonsense," said the voice. "It's frantic. Listen to me. I demonstrated conclusively this morning," began Kemp, "that invisibility—" "Never mind what you've demonstrated. I'm starving," said the voice. "And the night is chilly to a man without clothes." "Food," said Kemp. "Tumbler of whiskey tilted itself. Eyes," said the invisible man, rapping it down. "Have you a dressing gown?" Kemp made some exclamation in an undertone. He walked to a wardrobe and produced a robe of dingy scarlet. "This do?" he asked. It was taken from him, and limp for a moment in midair, fluttered weirdly, stood full and decorous, buttoning itself, and sat down in his chair drawer. "Socks, slippers would be a comfort," said the unseen curtly. "And food, anything. But this is the insanest thing I ever was in my life." He turned out his drawers for the articles, and then went downstairs to ransack his larder. He came back with some cold cutlets and bread, pulled up a light table, and placed them before his guest. "Never mind knives," said his visitor. "And a cutlet hung in midair with a sound of gnawing. Invisible," said Kemp, and sat down on a bedroom chair. He always liked to get something about me before I eat, said the invisible man. With a full mouth, eating greedily. Queer fancy, I suppose that wrist is all right, said Kim. Trust me? The invisible man of all the strange and wonderful. It's odd I should blunder into your house to get my bandaging. My first stroke of luck. Anyhow, I meant to sleep in this house tonight. You must stand that. It's a filthy nuisance, my blood showing, isn't it? Quite a clot over there. Gets visible as it coagulates, I see. It's only the living tissue I've changed, and only for as long as I'm alive. I've been in the house 3 hours. But how's it done? Began Kemp, in a tone of exasperation. Confound it. The whole business. It's unreasonable from beginning to end. Quite reasonable, said the invisible man. Perfectly reasonable. He reached over and secured the whiskey bottle. Kemp stared at the devouring dressing gown. A ray of candlelight, penetrating a torn patch in the right shoulder, made a triangle of light under the left ribs. What were the shots? He asked. How did the shooting begin? There was a real fool of a man, a sort of confederate of mine, curse him, who tried to steal my money. Has done so. Is he invisible too? No. Well, can't I have some more to eat before I tell you all that? I'm hungry, in pain. And you want me to tell stories? Kemp got up. You didn't do any shooting? He asked. Not me, said his visitor. Some fool I'd never seen fired at random. A lot of them got scared. They all got scared at me. Curse them. I say, I want more to eat than this. Kemp, I'll see what there is to eat downstairs, said Kemp. Not much. I'm afraid. After he had done eating, and he made a heavy meal, the invisible man demanded a cigar. He bit the end savagely before Kemp could find a knife, and cursed when the outer leaf loosened. It was strange to see him smoking. His mouth and throat, pharynx and nares, became visible as a sort of whirling smoke. Cast this blessed gift of smoking, he said, and puffed vigorously. I am lucky to have fallen upon you, Kemp. You must help me. Fancy tumbling on you just now. I'm in a devilish scrape. I've been mad, I think. The things I have been through. But we will do things yet. Let me tell you. He helped himself to more whiskey and soda. Kemp got up, looked about him, and fetched a glass from his spare room. It's wild. But I suppose I may drink. You haven't changed much, Kemp, these dozen years. You fair men don't. Cool and methodical after the first collapse. I must tell you, we will work together. But how was it all done? Said Kemp. And how did you get like this? For God's sake, let me smoke in peace for a little while, and then I will begin to tell you. But the story was not told that night. The invisible man's wrist was growing painful. He was feverish, exhausted, and his mind came round to brood upon his chase down the hill and the struggle about the inn. He spoke in fragments of marvel. He smoked faster. His voice grew angry. Sam tried to gather what he could. He was afraid of me. I could see that he was afraid of me, said the invisible man. Many times over he meant to give me the slip. He was always casting about. What a fool I was. Curie should have killed him. Where did you get the money? Asked Kemp, abruptly. The invisible man was silent for a space. I can't tell you tonight, he said. He groaned suddenly and leant forward, supporting his invisible head on invisible hands. Kemp, he said, I've had no sleep for near 3 days, except a couple of dozes of an hour or so. I must sleep soon. Well, have my room. Have this room. But how can I sleep? If I sleep, he will get away. What does it matter? What's the shot wound? Asked Kemp, abruptly. Nothing. Scratch and blood. Oh God, how I want sleep. Why not the Invisible Man appeared to be regarding Kemp, "'cause I've a particular objection to being caught by my fellow men," he said slowly. Kemp started full. "That I am," said the Invisible Man, striking the table smartly. "Put the idea into your head." Chapter 18. The Invisible Man sleeps. Exhausted and wounded as the Invisible Man was, he refused to accept Kemp's word that his freedom should be respected. He examined the 2 windows of the bedroom, drew up the blinds and opened the sashes, to confirm Kemp's statement that a retreat by them would be possible. Outside the night was very quiet and still, and the new moon was setting over the down. Then he examined the keys of the bedroom and the 2 dressing-room doors, to satisfy himself that these also could be made an assurance of freedom. Finally, he expressed himself satisfied. He stood on the hearth rug and Kemp heard the sound of a yawn. "I'm sorry," said the Invisible Man, "if I cannot tell you all that I have done tonight. I am worn out. It's grotesque, no doubt. It's horrible. But believe me, Kemp, in spite of your arguments of this morning, it is quite a possible thing. I have made a discovery. I meant to keep it to myself. I can't. I must have a partner. And we can do such things. But tomorrow. Now, Kemp, I feel as though I must sleep or perish." Kemp stood in the middle of the room staring at the headless Garmenti. "Suppose I must leave you," he said. "It's incredible. 3 things happening like this, overturning all my preconceptions, would make me insane. But it's real. Is there anything more that I can get you? Only bid me good night," said Griffin. "Good night," said Kemp, and shook an invisible hand. He walked sideways to the door. Suddenly the dressing gown walked quickly towards him. "Understand me," said the dressing gown. "No attempts to hamper me or capture me. Or—" Kemp's face changed a little. "Thought I gave you my word," he said. Kemp closed the door softly behind him, and the key was turned upon him forthwith. Then, as he stood with an expression of passive amazement on his face, the rapid feet came to the door of the dressing room, and that too was locked. Kemp slapped his brow with his hand. "Am I dreaming? Has the world gone mad? Or have I?" He laughed, and put his hand to the locked door. "Barred out of my own bedroom by a flagrant absurdity," he said. He walked to the head of the staircase, turned, and stared at the locked door. "It's fact," he said. He put his fingers to his slightly bruised neck. "Undeniable fact," but he shook his head hopelessly, turned, and went downstairs. He lit the dining room lamp, got out a cigar, and began pacing the room, ejaculating. Now and then he would argue with himself. "Invisible," he said. "Is there such a thing as an invisible animal? In the sea, yes. Thousands, millions. All the larvae, all the little Nauplii and Tornarias, all the microscopic things, the jellyfish. In the sea, there are more things invisible than visible. I never thought of that before. And in the ponds, too. All those little pond life things. Specks of colorless, translucent jelly. But in air? No, it can't be. Butte. After all, why not? If a man was made of glass, he would still be visible." His meditation became profound. The bulk of 3 cigars had passed into the invisible, or diffused, as a white ash, over the carpet, before he spoke again. Then, it was merely an exclamation. He turned aside, walked out of the room, and went into his little consulting room, and lit the gas there. It was a little room, because Dr. Kemp did not live by practice, and in it were the day's newspapers. The morning's paper lay carelessly opened and thrown aside. He caught it up, turned it over, and read the account of a strange story from Iping that the mariner at Port Stowe had spelt over so painfully to Mr. Marvel. Kemp read it swiftly. "Wrapped up," said Kemp, disguised. "Hiding it. No one seems to have been aware of his misfortune. What the devil is his game? He dropped the paper, and his eye went seeking he said, and caught up the St. James's Gazette, lying folded up as it arrived. Now we shall get at the truth, said Dr. Kemp. He rent the paper open. A couple of columns confronted him: an entire village in Sussex goes mad was the heading. Good heavens, said Kemp, reading eagerly an incredulous account of the events in Iping of the previous afternoon that have already been described. Over the leaf, the report in the morning paper had been reprinted. He reread Itron through the streets, striking right and left. Gaffers, insensible. Mr. Huckster in great pain, still unable to describe what he saw. Painful humiliation. Vicar. Woman ill with terror. Windows smashed. This extraordinary story probably a fabrication. Too good not to print. Come grano. He dropped the paper and stared blankly in front of him. Probably a fabrication. He caught up the paper again and reread the whole business. But when does the tramp come in? Why the deuce was he chasing a tramp? He sat down abruptly on the surgical bench. He's not only invisible, he said, but he's mad. Homicidal. When dawn came to mingle its pallor with the lamplight and cigar smoke of the dining room, Kemp was still pacing up and down, trying to grasp the incredible. He was altogether too excited to sleep. His servants, descending sleepily, discovered him, and were inclined to think that overstudy had worked this ill on him. He gave them extraordinary but quite explicit instructions to lay breakfast for two in the Belvedere study, and then to confine themselves to the basement and ground floor. Then he continued to pace the dining room until the morning's paper came. It had much to say and little to tell, beyond the confirmation of the evening before, and a very badly written account of another remarkable tale from Port Burdock. This gave Kemp the essence of the happenings at the Jolly Cricketers, and the name of Marvell Hay has made me keep with him 24 hours, Marvell testified. Certain minor facts were added to the Iping story, notably the cutting of the village telegraph wire. But there was nothing to throw light on the connection between the invisible man and the tramp, for Mr. Marvell had supplied no information about the 3 books, or the money with which he was lined. The incredulous tone had vanished, and a shoal of reporters and inquirers were already at work elaborating the matter. Kemp read every scrap of the report and sent his housemaid out to get every one of the morning papers she could. These also he devoured. He is invisible, he said, and it reads like rage growing to mania. The things he may do. The things he may do. And he's upstairs free as the air. What on earth ought I to do, for instance? Would it be a breach of faith if... No, he went to a little untidy desk in the corner and began a note. He tore this up half-written and wrote another. He read it over and considered it. Then he took an envelope and addressed it to Colonel Addy, Port Burdock. The invisible man awoke even as Kemp was doing this. He awoke in an evil temper, and Kemp, alert for every sound, heard his pattering feet rush suddenly across the bedroom overhead. Then a chair was flung over and the washhand stand tumbler smashed. Kemp hurried upstairs and rapped eagerly.